Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto is a single father. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Annoyed. That pretty much summed up how Naruto Uzumaki was feeling at the moment. One second he was messing around with flying thunder god Sealore, using Jiraiya's and his father's notes, and the next second it explodes and he wakes up to find himself in some city. Now he hadn't been the sharpest kunai in the set in his early years and even into his teens, but he had made it a point to become much smarter. And he was on his way to Hokage before this mess. But that's not really important. The point was that he was smart and knowledgeable enough to know that seals could do some pretty impossible things. Things like hold back a millennia-old chakra beast powerful enough to create tsunamis and level mountains with just a swipe of its tails. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched to assume that they could transport a person to another world or dimension. And that was exactly what Naruto had assumed happened. The reason he thought this was because no one in this new place spoke his language. Or at least not exactly. He was able to hold a conversation with a man who spoke a language called Japanese. It was quite similar but still had differences. And through this man he was able to learn English. The man's name was Frederick Chase. Frederick was able to teach him English over the span of 6 months. It was around that time that he told Frederick about himself. It was only right because the man had let him room with him and provided for him. At first his friend didn't believe him and called him crazy. That was before Naruto showed him the shadow clone. Frederick had promptly fainted after this particular revelation but woke up soon after. But then Frederick started asking limitless questions about where the blonde came from and the culture. Mostly the military aspect. Naruto was happy to answer his friend's questions, but he knew he had to work on becoming a part of society. He had thought it would have been hard, but it was quite the opposite. All he had to do was use genjutsu and ninja skills. Very soon Naruto had taken the oath and recited the Pledge of Allegiance and was an official citizen of the United States. That brought him to the present and why he was annoyed. He was broke. No money. None. And he couldn't rely on Freddy, his nickname for Frederick, forever. He didn't want to work. That wasn't his style. He had become too much like Jiraiya for that to ever work. That's it, he thought as he sat on the small couch in Freddy's dorm room. He reached into the pouch he had on him when he was transported to this place and he pulled out a small green book. The Tale of a Gutsy Ninja was the first book Jiraiya had ever written. In Naruto's opinion it was bestseller material, but it had never taken off back home. However, Naruto figured that was because about 80% of men in the elemental nations were closet perverts that only enjoyed reading smut. And Naruto wasn't about to republish Icha Icha. He would never let that abomination loose in this world. So that's what he would do. He would republish Jiraiya's book and then write a few of his own based on his own experiences. Naruto smiled to himself, okay. No more being dead broke. But first, coffee. With that said, he found Freddy's wallet and took out a few bucks. He'd be able to repay him later. Probably. He smiled and set out for downtown San Francisco. She sighed, sipping slowly on her latte. Her dark hair was tucked up into a red beret, which matched her red and cream plaid shorts. Blending was crucial when one was as she was. She felt masculine eyes upon her from almost every side, and rolled her own. Strife and discord. Chaos. She turned her eyes upon a classic surfer, and his eyes went blank. He suddenly walked into the center of the coffee shop and did the funky chicken all the way out the door. She sighed and relaxed, sipping at her latte again. There was one less problem. But there was always another that showed up to replace him. She crossed her legs, then uncrossed them, then crossed them again. She rolled her shoulders and tried to relax, tried to blend. But her goddess temptations demanded to be scratched. She smiled as another blonde-haired, blue-eyed youth replaced the surfer she had sent out the door dancing. Her eyes narrowed with interest, flashing red for a split second. There was something about him, something hiding. Something her libido liked. She smirked softly, deciding to fuck with him. Just enough to test that chaos in his heart. She chuckled. She hadn't spent this much time scheming since the beginning of the Trojan War. He was no Paris, but instead of a golden apple, he would get a golden coffee. He placed his order, eyes darting around, not nervous but observatory. When she felt his eyes sweep her body, she moved, very slightly, but enough that his eyes darted back to her dark eyes, her neckline, her tattoos. She focused on the barista taking his order. Something simple. She liked that in a man. Kept things less complicated. All he wanted was an espresso. Boring. She smirked and gently, carefully, twisted the barista's hand on the cashier to a venti, vanilla soy decaf latte with extra whipped cream. She sipped at her drink again, and sat back to watch the scene. He stood there for a while, and seemed to realize his order was taking longer than needed. He began to drum his fingers impatiently on the counter, rolling his eyes. When he was handed the cup, covered in black markings in the barista's rapid handwriting, he arched an eyebrow, then took a weary sip. His eyebrows shot up and he frowned. She chuckled, her eyes narrowed in mischief. He carefully set down the cup, and his eyes turned different. He was turned away from her, so she couldn't exactly see their color, but could tell they had gone from blue to another. She frowned and watched with fascinated eyes as he reached over the counter, and while the barista's back was turned, flipped a switch on the steamer. The air was quickly filled with hot water vapor, and the smoke alarms went crazy. A magnificent din was raised as the sprinklers came on, and the coffee shop was evacuated with the speed of lightning. She watched him run, pretending to be startled, and then upset that he was wet. She started to laugh, long, deep, hearty laughs. Her shirt may have been clinging to her like soaked second skin, but she could care less. A little bit of chaos always made her feel better. And gods, she knew she needed it. Then his eyes turned to her laughter, again scanning her tattoos, her neckline, the way her chest was moving because of her laughter. Her breath caught in her throat as she met his eyes, then she smiled shyly, but she let her eyes sparkle naughtily. What had she found now? Why was she laughing? That one thought kept running through the blonde's head as he watched the woman. He should have ruined her day by pulling that little stunt, but she looked happy as if she had just won the lottery. Okay, now she wasn't laughing anymore. But she seemed to be staring at him like a lioness would a wounded antelope. Like she was ready to pounce on him and tear his throat out, or do something less violent but equally as frightening to his naive virgin mind. Naruto pivoted around on his right foot and stuffed his hands in his jean pockets, intent on getting as far away from the lady as possible. He was able to get a couple steps away before her voice rung out and made him freeze. "I saw what you did back there." Naruto sighed and looked back with an apologetic look on his face. "Look, lady. I'm sorry about your clothes, but they mucked up my order and I'm running on fumes as it is. I don't have enough money for that crap." The woman just chuckled, walked towards him sensually. "I said I saw what you did. I never said that I didn't like it. I liked it very much, in fact. It was very chaotic." Naruto gulped as she got closer. She was really pretty and her wet clothes were not helping his case in the least. He tried to keep his eyes on her face as she walked towards him, but he was failing miserably. He also managed to notice that she was smirking at him. Before he knew it, the woman, who he had never met, was latched onto his arm. Naruto felt a surge tear through him as she touched him. It felt like lightning and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But most of all, it made him feel vulnerable. He didn't know where it was coming from, but this woman had power in her. Lots of it. "So, do you like what you see?" The sound of the woman's sultry voice brought Naruto back to reality. He couldn't help but be smothered by the woman's presence and aura. It was warm but also very charged and erratic. For some reason it felt similar to how he felt when he used Kurama's chakra. And that put him on guard. However, despite his suspicion, the woman's close proximity had him flustered. His reply to her question came out weak as he stumbled over his words. "I think you are very pretty. Much more so than other ladies I've seen." The woman's eyes sparkled with mischievous delight as she reached up with her right hand and traced the line of the blonde's jaw slowly with her index finger. Again, the electric surge ripped its way through Naruto's body and sent shivers down his spine as goosebumps rose on his skin. "Ah, such a sweet thing to say. You're such a gentleman," the woman whispered smugly. "You aren't too bad yourself, Blondie." She stood on her tiptoes and whispered huskily into his ear, "In fact, I would say that you are rather ravishing." Naruto felt the heat rise into his neck and continue onto his face before finally pooling under his eyes in a bright red blush. He had to get away from this woman. She was confusing him and fucking with his head big time, and he could tell that she was enjoying every second of it. He did the only thing he could think of and pulled the woman into his arms so that his hands were concealed behind her back. The woman eeped before looking up at him with an annoyed smirk. "Well, someone is certainly bold. First you get me soaking wet and now you do this. I don't even know your The woman was cut off as the muscular blonde in front of her disappeared in an orange flash of light. Her smirk became an angry scowl. Naruto leaned onto one of the giant trees of the redwood forest that he had teleported to. He took in deep breaths and the flush slowly faded from his face. He sighed and started walking back towards the bridge. Walks were good for thinking and he had a lot to think about. Her eyes narrowed in displeasure. Whatever. Animalistic. Part of him that was the center of the chaos that surrounded him. She wanted it. Badly. She smirked suavely and began to calculate a way to get even with him. She turned away from the coffee shop, irritatedly drying her clothes and changing them. She turned down a dark alley, her hair pulled away from her face, braided to the back of her head, letting it hang free there. Now she wore black, a halter top that ended below the arch of her ribs, and tight black shorts that were as short as they came. She was whistled at, but paid no attention to it. She had a fixed destination in her mind, and at the end of the alley, turned back to the mouth of the alley and grinned at the people who had catcalled after her, and vanished into a wisp of silver fog that dissipated in mere seconds. She reappeared, crouched in a pile of dead leaves, with no sound. She watched him move through the forest, hands stuck in his pockets. She frowned. He moved like a warrior. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes darted to the shadows, watching for anything that might show itself and prove its idiocy. She smirked, and her body shrank, covering itself with fur as her nose elongated and she grew a tail. She bounded through the leaves, a little black fox with amber eyes and a white-tipped tail. She let her pink tongue hang out of her mouth as she ran ahead of him, curling up in the roots of a giant redwood. He walked past, kicking a small rock he had found on the trail, still scanning the shadows for any anomaly. She shut her eyes quickly, as he passed her, careful to remain absolutely still. When she could see no more of the front of his shirt, she crept from her hiding spot and bolted after him. His ears twitched, and he rounded to face her, his stance defensive. She tucked her tail between her legs and flattened her ears, her wet little nose twitching in curiosity. She crept toward him, and took his pant leg in her teeth and tugged, bounding away. When he didn't follow, she returned, meek and cautious, tugging his pant leg harder, then leading him away again. He followed hesitantly, and she rolled in the leaves, trying to taunt him into chasing her. When he finally picked up the pace to a jog, she began to dart in and out of the trees like she owned them, making him veer off course suddenly, randomly. Chaotically. A briar thicket was her destination, a small tunnel having been dug into it, so only an animal about her size could enter. When she arrived, panting with exertion, and crawled into the thorns, she froze wondering if he would follow. She somehow turned around without getting pricked, and stuck her head out the small opening. She yelped at him, and made the closest thing she could to a smile while in this form, before entering the thicket. She crawled slowly through the thicket, having heard him enter behind her. She crawled at faster, so all he ever saw was her white-tipped tail vanishing around a corner. She then started to run, and he started to curse, struggling through the barbed plant with some creative vocabulary. When he did emerge into the enter of the thicket, all he saw was her, submerged in a natural spring of crystal-clear water, back in her mortal form. She was combing the braid out of her hair with her fingers, humming softly to herself, the smooth, pale skin of her back only interrupted by the dark ink of her tattoo. She heard him stop and draw in a breath. She smiled and stopped humming. She did not turn her body, but dropped one shoulder to growl at him. "How dare you even begin to think that you could run? No man ever flees my grasp." The power and ferocity in his voice made her shiver, and she could feel the blonde's eyes on her. "I don't know what game this is. I don't want to play anymore." She moved toward him, staying within her pool, resting her arms on the banks. "I think you do. If you win, there's a prize to be had." He stiffened. She raised herself out of the pool, and sat on the bank, still turned away from him. He said angrily, making her shiver again, making fire run through her limbs. "You're going to tell me who you are. Now." He was making demands of her. Her eyes flashed red. How dare he? She turned over her shoulder, letting her torso follow her, showing him a side profile. "My name is Ayala. It's Greek." She could feel his eyes on her, and longed for them when they darted around the thicket, as if waiting for something to attack him. "My name is Na." She stood and walked toward him, and he froze mid-name. She could care less. "It doesn't matter. I know what you are, and that's what matters." He got tense again. "Damn it. Remember, if you play, you could win the prize." She laced her fingers in his, and he grew even more tense, ever so slightly leaning away from her, his stance still defensive and on edge. He frowned, looking her up and down. She watched relief flood his eyes when he saw her bikini, which nearly matched her skin tone. He looked back to her face, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. "What am I, then? What do you know?" She stretched up, her eyes turning heated. She put her lips close to his ear, her hand on his shoulder. "I know you are a man." He shuddered, and she slowly began to move her hand over his right pectoral, down toward his navel. "I also know you have never known the—" He inhaled sharply, and she stopped moving her hand, and drew it away from his waistband. "Never imagined." She pressed herself closer, and his arms were around her, hands in the small of her back. She released a small sound of surprise, and pulled away, but his arms were like iron. She took another step back, actively fighting him, but he moved with her, his eyes locked on her face. Her eyes flashed, and without thinking about it, she struck him, moving like a cobra, her hiss of displeasure echoing through the forest. He released her, then something happened, something that she had not expected. He moved so fast, all she saw was a blur, then he towered over her, hand drawn back into a tight fist, his eyes hard, angry and bright red with slitted pupils. She saw a sudden flashback, another man who had towered over her with his fists drawn back, his eyes burning like two live coals embedded in his skull. He had struck her before, when she was young, when she was weak. When she couldn't protect herself. He swung down, but didn't connect. He managed to stop himself, and she watched, tense, as his eyes flickered back and forth between blue and red. He turned away from her, and got back down on his hands and knees ready to crawl back through the briars. "Strike me." He turned to her, looking confused. "Why?" She grabbed him by the back of the shirt and hauled him to his feet, and snarled into his face. "You aren't even man enough to strike me? A helpless female?" He snarled. "Real men don't abuse females." She smacked him, raising a welt on his face with the flat palm of her hand. "What have you got between your legs?" His eyes were red again. She could care less. "Strike me. No, you neutered little son of a bitch. There's nothing there, is there?" She made a motion like she was jacking off, then her fist exploded in his general direction. She snarled, and strode toward him, her own eyes dark and dangerous. He watched her approach him, his stance tensed and his eyes red. She drew back, and swung forward. He snarled, smacked her wrist out of the way, grabbed her shoulder in a pincer-like hold and drove her to the ground. He put his knee in the small of her back, pinning her to the cold, hard ground, with her arms twisted behind her back. She whimpered, and feeling him over her, dominant and tense, and so obviously dominant was enough to send her over the edge. She whimpered, and hid her face. She disappeared, vanishing into silver smoke, leaving no trace of herself behind. Naruto picked himself up off the ground and ran a hand through his blonde locks as he let out a sigh. He took a look at his surrounding and noticed that the sun was getting lower in the sky. He looked at the ground where the woman used to lay and grimaced in displeasure. "Ayala. I have a feeling that I'll be seeing more of her. And I'm not sure whether or not that's a good thing." He disappeared in an orange flash and reappeared in front of Freddy's dorm. When he entered the actual room, he noticed Frederick on the couch with the biggest smile on his face, and in comparison, Naruto had a rather large frown. They locked eyes as they both spoke at the same time. "You won't believe the day I had. I met this girl." Naruto looked at his friend strangely before sighing and sitting down next to him. He made himself comfortable and motioned for Freddy to continue. "You first." He thought he recognized her. She was younger, maybe as young as he had been when Kurama had been sealed into his mind. He frowned, and looked at her again. He remembered visiting the museum with Freddy, especially spending time in the Greek exhibits and the clothes of the young girls. She was wearing white with medallions on both shoulders. 12 or younger. He peeked out from behind an ornate Ionic column draped in ivy, as she played with a bundle of black fur that lapped at her cheeks with a soft pink tongue. She giggled, her amber eyes lighting up as two small paws were placed on her shoulders, so the tiny muzzle could get closer to her face. He stepped forward, smiling childishly, for some reason feeling like he wanted to play. Suddenly, someone much older than her, bolted across the hall, bronze armor glinting in the sunlight. The man was tall, broad across the shoulders, with short-cropped dark hair and chocolate eyes. His mouth was set in a snarl, and he grasped at a short sword on his belt. There was no way he saw her, his eyes facing through an archway, not looking at the floor or his feet. Ayala squealed and scrambled out of the way, holding the little bundle of fur close to her chest. The man looked down on her with scorn evident in his eyes. He stopped in his tracks as the bundle of fur yelped at him and attacked one of his sandals. It seemed to enjoy chewing on the leather straps. He snarled down at the animal, then turned his eyes on Ayala. "What's this? Your little pet?" He stooped and grabbed the scruff of the little animal by his feet, revealing to Naruto a black fox kid with ice blue eyes. She wailed, "Put Sinopa down, put her down." The fox barked at the soldier, trying to take a swipe at him with tiny needle-sharp claws. The man snarled, "A fox? Really? You chose this scrap of fur to represent you?" He threw the kid to the ground with enough force to put a crack in the marble. It yelped once, then did not stir. She wailed and ran to it, her eyes running with tears. She cradled the kid in her arms and looked up at the man, her thin arms trying to bring it back. He had pulled a horsewhip from the right side of his belt, uncoiling it in his hands, slowly, deliberately. She trembled and stood as if in a trance. "Artaxias, please, I don't wanna," he snarled. "Toes and fingers, show me." She whimpered and left the bundle of fur at her feet. "Artaxias, big brother, Artaxias." The whip cracked over her head and she screamed. He roared, "Don't call me that. Artaxias is gone. I am Ares now." He snapped the whip back and threw his arm forward again. The tail of the whip wrapped around her arm and she screamed. He had cut her to the bone. Her blood sparkled in the dust like gold dust. As he yanked her forward by the arm he snarled, pulling her a few feet forward with every word. "Listen, you are not my sister. No simpering whiny little bitch like you could be the sister to the god of war." He crouched down and took her chin in his hands. "Darling," she whimpered. "Yes?" He struck her hard across the face with his fist. "No man will ever want you. No real man. Get your eyes off Alcaeus and move on. I'm the only real man who will ever want to." He caressed the side of her face in a way that made Naruto growl with anger. Ayala nodded in understanding, got up, and ran down the hall. She looked back over her shoulder before disappearing through an archway. The hall went dark, the only thing remaining the eyes of the soldier in bronze armor, which had begun to glow a bright orange. Like two live coals embedded in his skull. Watching. As Naruto woke, his cerulean eyes slowly opened. He groaned and threw the covers off of his sweat-soaked form. With a swing of his legs he sat up on the edge of the bed and cradled his throbbing head in his hands. What the hell kind of dream was that? He couldn't even properly call it a dream. It felt too real to be a dream. It was more like a memory. But it wasn't a memory that belonged to him. And to go along with the weird dream he felt sick. He never got sick thanks to Kurama, but his whole body felt like it was on fire and his head felt like it was going to split open. And then it hit him. It was a violent feeling of vertigo and it made his stomach flip suddenly. In an instant Naruto found himself in the bathroom that was adjoined to his bedroom, heaving over his toilet as his late-night dinner came rushing back out. This went on for a good 2 minutes before he had spewed out the last of the vomit. He stood shakily to his knees and made his over to the sink. With a twist, the water was turned on and the blonde started rinse his mouth to get rid of the vile taste. The cold marble of the counter felt great on his burning skin as he slouched down onto it while he brushed his teeth. After he scrubbed his mouth free of germs, Naruto decided it was time to get rid of the sweat that had soaked his clothes and his sheets. He swaggered over to the rather large walk-in shower that adorned his bathroom. He dropped his sweatpants and boxers before he stepped into the glass enclosure. He closed the sliding door and sealed it shut. Soon enough the shower head was shooting out a steady stream of hot water. The glass and mirrors in the bathroom were quickly fogged up with steam. Naruto sighed in contentment as the water splashed over his skin. His hands were braced against the wall and his head was turned towards the floor. His blonde locks slowly became plastered to his skull and he ran a hand through them with another sigh. He loved taking showers. They helped him clear his head and get ready for the day. But now his head was far from clear. He grimaced as a flash from the dream rushed through his mind and he saw the little girl from his dream crying over the poor little fox. He tried to reason in his mind for the dream like Ino had taught him to. She had said that sometimes dreams, or nightmares in his case, usually had a meaning. They were the mind's subconscious trying to tell you something. But just like the nightmares that he'd had after she died, he couldn't find a meaning in this dream. He had never seen the man in his life. However, he did know Ayala. Naruto shook his head free of the image and got on with his shower. He didn't need to worry about it. It was probably something he ate anyway. That would explain his sickness anyway. At least that was how he rationalized it. After about 20 minutes, Naruto was dressed in pajama pants and a tight white t-shirt. He sat down at his office desk and started setting his typewriter up. He had finally gotten his hands on one. Like he had predicted, Jiraiya's book had sold quickly and often, and now Naruto was living comfortably in a rather large 3-bedroom apartment that wasn't too far away from Freddy's college dorm. He had turned one bedroom into his office and the other into storage. The master bedroom was furnished nicely with a king-sized bed that he only used half of. The comforter was custom-made and was black with a large 9-tailed fox depicted over a large part of it. His sheets were orange and so were his pillowcases. He had gotten permission to paint and he had drawn the symbol of the hidden leaf on his ceiling. All in all, it felt a lot like home. Just noisier. He took a sip of his coffee and got to work on his next story. The Tale of Naruto Namikaze. It was going to be a multiple book series, and honestly Naruto looked forward to writing it. It would be nice to get these stories off his chest. He felt as if they deserved to be shared with someone. So he would start from the beginning. And he would leave nothing out. To the people reading it would be a riveting and heartbreaking tale that would leave them crying tears of sadness and joy. It would make some scream and some cheer. But to him it was an autobiography. His life really happened. The only thing he regretted was knowing that he was the only one who would ever know that fact. The walls and ceiling were black stone. The floor was red carpet. A woman in a black chiton lounged on velvet upholstery that had seen some wear, but otherwise looked fine. The room was dark, naturally, lit only by a few candles that burned bright green. The sounds that filtered through the open window were screams of desperation and cries of eternal torment. Easily tuned out. She was reading. The candles flickered, but other than that, all was still. There was no wind or unusual sound that disturbed her, as a page turned, gold eyes scanning the last paragraph of the book skeptically. The main character she didn't like. The plot had holes she found to be filled with secrets, and the whole concept unsettled her. A complicated childhood, a tortured adolescence, all leading up to a lonely existence. So original. She turned another page and sighed, glad it was almost over. She was sure it would entertain the minds of teenage girls with nothing better to do than cry and eat ice cream and complain about their lowly little lives. Mortals. Disgusting. Last paragraph, thank the gods. The war destroyed him, destroyed his friendship, his trust, his happiness. But he continued on, an existence that leaves much to be desired, surrounded by ghosts of his past at every step he takes. The only girl he ever loved, his brother, his family, all lost to the war, and every battle was made personal. Not just a war between nations, but a war for control and a war for protection and a war for discovery. Oh, stop repeating yourself and get the point, she murmured under her breath. But the war made him who he is. And he is strong. And that's all that mattered in the end, right? The book snapped shut and was tossed into the middle of the room. She got up, the black fabric silken and contrasting her alabaster white skin. A bookshelf rose out of the gloom, and her hands scanned the shelves, searching for the other books in the series. Her eyes flared when she found them, and she tossed them into the center of the room with the last one, her frayed nerves getting ready to split. The author made everything so damn personal. Jiraiya Kazama. The name filled her mouth with poison and her eyes with tears. Never in her life had she wanted so badly to throttle someone and hug them at the same time. She scooped the books into her arms and walked stately down the stairs, past the throne room of the grand castle below. Her uncle called to her from the throne of onyx with the finger-bone lattice. "Ayala, what brings you down here?" "An errand," she answered vaguely, really not wanting to talk to him. "Nosy little bugger." A dark shadow of a man appeared in front of her, blocking her way through the front doors. She tried to check her way past him, shoving at him hard with her shoulder. "Move," she snarled, eyes flashing. When he didn't, she smiled, and added, "Please." Still, there was no movement from the god of the dead. "What errand, Ayala?" She smiled. "The one that doesn't involve you sticking your long hooked nose into my business." "Scram. Don't take that tone with me, young lady." She stuck her tongue out at him in response. "Don't take that tone with me, old man," she mimicked cruelly. He frowned and stepped aside as she skipped through the jewel gardens, No plant growing in the underworld, all the way to the river Lethe, the second of the black rivers, the river of forgetfulness. Page by page, she tossed all 6 lengthy books into the Lethe, the tears starting to come as she remembered all of Naruto's pain, of his grief and loneliness. Everything that made them alike. Their childhood of segregation and torment, their adolescence of training and being lied to and pain, and finally an adulthood of sorrow and anguish. And the fox. She shivered when she thought of the fox. What they called chakra, she called dynami, and the fox had such a dominant strength that her training began to kick in. The training her brother had given her, those millennium ago. She shivered, falling to her knees in the gravel as fire burned in her belly and her muscles clenched. She hated this feeling. It made her feel dirty and used. But she was. The tears began to fall, staining the gravel with glittering gold liquid. Her own war had made her who she was. She was beaten on the inside. And that all that mattered in the end, right? Naruto smiled as he drove through the streets of downtown San Francisco. He was cruising in his red 1992 Chevy Corvette C4. He had only been able to legally drive for a short time, but he could honestly say that it was one of his favorite things to do. It gave him a sense of freedom and peace. He even knew how to fix it if it was broken. Or at least in theory. He had one of his clones on full-time reading duty. And pretty much all he ever read were mechanic books and instructional booklets. He was even considering going to special classes so he could work on cars. The things fascinated him. Planes, tanks, and guns were other hobbies of his. At least he liked to read about them. But that wasn't the highlight of his day. He was finally gonna get to meet this girl that Freddy was always talking about. They were meeting up at some bookstore called Barnes & Noble. Apparently it sold coffee as well. Naruto practically ran on coffee, so of course he didn't object to the rendezvous. Soon enough he was pulling into a parking spot and he exited his beloved vehicle. It was mid-July and it was plenty hot outside. He walked into the store and inhaled deeply before smiling. He loved that smell, the smell of paper and coffee. It was what his office smelled like. He saw his books on one of the first shelves in the store, in the bestseller section. That fact made his chest swell with pride. He must be a pretty good writer. Only Freddy knew that he was the one who wrote the books. He heard a shout and turned to the coffee shop part of the establishment. He saw Freddy sitting with a rather good-looking blonde woman. Damn, Freddy must have some secret skills if he'd been able to snag her. He himself couldn't even get a girlfriend. Not that he'd been actively looking for one, but still. You'd think that some girl would at least talk to him. Maybe his rugged hotness didn't affect California girls? Damn you, other blonde-haired blue-eyed surfer dudes. Those guys were cramping his style. But he thought he was dressed pretty good today. His was wearing a white polo shirt with black slacks and black Vans. He pulled it off. He walked over to their table and slipped into a chair. He grinned and turned to Freddy, who was dressed similarly to himself with a white dress shirt and black slacks. Sup, buddy? You mind introducing me to the pretty lady? Freddy, for his part, just chuckled good-naturedly and smiled at the woman. Well, this is Akila. The now-named woman waved with a smile, to which Naruto responded with one of his own. Freddy continued and patted his blonde best friend on the shoulder. And Akila, this guy right here is Naruto. Akila eeped and her eyebrows rose with surprise. Naruto? Your name is Naruto? The blonde in question tilted his head in confusion before nodding. Is that a problem? He didn't understand why she would make a big deal about his name. It wasn't common, but then again neither was hers. She shook her head quickly before reaching into her purse. Of course not. It's just that the main character's name, in this book series I've been reading, is Naruto. With that said, she pulled out the 6th and final book in the series that he wrote, which in turn caused Freddy and Naruto to stiffen for a moment. But in true Naruto fashion he played it off by starting a conversation about said book. Oh really? Well, that's quite the coincidence. Is it any good? She nodded her head violently. It is very well written. At first glance the emotional plotline seems very cliché, but the whole concept is very original and quite thought out. I've shed quite a few tears over this series. The author gets you invested in so many characters and then they die. It's very brutal. Naruto let one of his eyebrows rise. Brutal? Yes. The whole concept of the shinobi is brutal in and of itself. They are trained from a young age to fight and kill for their village. It's very controversial, but it's portrayed in a way that makes it acceptable, Akila explained, and this war that he is in is very emotional. It's not like other books. It's as if the author was actually there. It describes the emotional distress of having to fight your dead teachers, lovers, and family in extreme detail. Naruto looked at her strangely. She said that as if she knew the feeling. Then his eyes narrowed. He was getting that same feeling from this woman that he did from Ayala. The feeling that she was holding something back. And then he noticed her eyes. Her irises were gray, but they seemed to be shifting, like clouds in a storm. They weren't natural, and he was gonna call her on it. You have the most peculiar eyes, Akila, Naruto stated in a curious tone. Said eyes widened in major surprise and she didn't respond. But Freddy did. Freddy turned to his friend in confusion. What do you mean, Naruto? They're blue just like yours. He was beginning to think his friend was crazy. He was looking at Akila and her eyes were most definitely blue. Now it was Naruto's turn to be confused. No, they aren't. They are gray. Can't you see? This was getting weird. Either Freddy was fucking with him or he really couldn't see them. Naruto, are you feeling okay? I know you haven't been getting rest because of these dreams you've been having. Maybe you should go see a doctor or something, Freddy suggested with concern for his friend. Naruto was about to respond when suddenly his head started throbbing violently. He felt a pressure in the back of his mind. That was the feeling he got when someone was trying to cast a genjutsu on him. And those didn't work because he was so in tune with Kurama. So that meant someone was trying to put him under an illusion. His eyes narrowed and the pain became more intense as his eyes started to flicker between red and blue. He groaned and cradled his head in his hands. Freddy got up from his chair and shook Naruto's shoulder. You okay, buddy? Do you need me to take you to the hospital? Naruto groaned again and just waved him off. No. I think I'll just go home and rest. I've been running on fumes for a few days now. He stood up slowly and looked at Akila. I'm sorry. I'm not feeling well. Perhaps we can meet again some other time. Akila didn't respond right away. Her gray eyes seemed to be searching his form for something that wasn't there. Finally she nodded and spoke quietly. Yes. I think that would be better. I hope you feel better. Naruto nodded and made his way back to his car. He entered his apartment sometime later and he could honestly say that maybe he did need to go to the hospital. His headache did not get better when he left. In fact, it had gotten much worse. And his body felt like it was on fire, again for the second time in 2 months. He stumbled into his bedroom and turned the thermostat down to the lowest setting before pulling off his clothes and climbing into bed. He was asleep almost as soon as his throbbing head hit the pillow. He watched her from a distance, her dark hair held back in a fishtail braid, her eyes flashing happily. She ran through the halls, laughing, as she was chased by a white bloodhound with red eyes. It wasn't hers, as it had a leather collar around its neck with a tag in the shape of a sickle. She laughed when it caught up with her, and patted its head with long, slim fingers. It ran off, leaving her outside in a garden filled with calla lilies in all the colors of the rainbow. She seemed particularly attached to a bed of blue ones, so dark they were nearly black. Ayala knelt in the garden, pulling her chitin up to her knees so it didn't get dirty. He noticed it wasn't quite white anymore, but closer to blue, a pastel color that made her amber eyes stand out vividly. He walked forward and knelt next to her, touching her arm. She looked up and around, confused by his touch. She brushed her arm with her fingers, as if trying to get rid of cobwebs clinging to her skin. A young boy with black hair and black eyes trotted up behind her, and poked her shoulder with a giggle. Naruto noticed with curiosity that the little boy had black feathered wings folded neatly against his back, the feathers angled in a similar fashion to a raven's. She smiled, and turned to him, brushing her hands clean before stooping down to his level to hug him. The white bloodhound came trotting up behind the little boy, and eyed Ayala with contempt. Ayala whipped her head up at the clink of bronze on bronze. The armored man stood around a corner in the garden, smiling at her with hunger in his eyes. Naruto snarled. She pushed the little boy away from her as the armored man began his approach. Run then. He looked confused, but it's just Uncle Ares. She put him on the back of the bloodhound, her eyes tearing. Just go. You don't have to watch this. Ares grabbed her. She fought back, slapping the hindquarters of the bloodhound into motion. As the white dog took off, the boy named then clutching to its scruff, watching his aunt disappear from his sight. Naruto still crouched in the calla lilies, but the dream had stolen his movements from him. He was stuck here, in the mountaintop garden, watching her. Ares caressed the side of her face, his eyes orange and full of lust. Aella whispered, "If Dad finds out, he'll kill you." Ares laughed, and lowered his face to hers, pinning her against a trellis so she couldn't lean away. "Dad is married to his sister, and how many children so they have?" He fingered her chitin, seeming to marvel at the loss of the white color. "You've ripened. You've flowered." She snarled at him, her eyes turning red around the edges. "Get away from me, Artaxias." Ares snarled, raising a fist to intimidate her into doing his will. "How many times have I told you not to call me that, darling?" He widened his stance, preparing to deliver a blow. Naruto snarled under his breath, eyes narrowing. Kick him where it counts." She snarled and lowered her center of gravity, and he encouraged her from the sidelines. "Now, do it now." Her hands balled and somehow she got between his breastplate and his helm, delivering a blow to his chin that sent him reeling. She ran, and Naruto felt himself pulled along as if attached to her by an invisible rope that had been tied around his waist. Somehow, she was fast enough to duck behind a fountain half the garden away, angling her body so she matched the statuette that she had pressed her back against. Her eyes were bright red, and she was shaking with either rage or fear. The man called from across the garden, his voice floating on the wind like a feather. "You can run, sweet cheeks, but you can't hide." "Sweet cheeks?" she snarled to herself. Her nose wrinkled and she stepped out from behind the statuette, her hands clenched into fists. "Don't call me that." He was right there, in her face, leering down at her with murderous intent. "Let's try this again, shall we?" He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her into the air as she struggled. She tried to swing at him, kick at him, but he held her far from his body so she could do little but place a glancing blow to his forearm. Naruto watched as her face began to turn red, and her struggles became weak. Ares whispered in her ear, as she gasped for breath. "This form is still mortal, Aella. It would be a shame for you to have an accident." Aella managed to gasp out, "Fuck you." He smirked softly, gladly. He grabbed her chitin with his other hand and tore it away, smiling as she screamed raggedly. He threw her to the ground and pinned her, fumbling with something laced beneath his armor. "You beautiful little bitch." She screamed for her father. She screamed for her mother. She screamed for someone, somewhere to help her. He flipped her onto her belly, pushing her face into the dirt. She was instantly muffled, pinned down and unable to move. He managed to grunt through his clenched teeth, bent over her. "I've got a little present for you." A second before it happened, Naruto somehow managed to close his eyes and turn his face away. But just because he couldn't see it, didn't mean it didn't happen. She screamed like a banshee, losing her sanity as he tore through her, howling his success like the dog he was. She screamed and screamed until he was finished with her, then left her in the garden as night fell, abandoned like a battlefield corpse. Her screams still lingered as the garden turned dark, haunting screams that stuck in Naruto's ears. She lay trembling among her calla lilies, eyes terrified and ashamed. They locked eyes, blue to amber, in a cry for help. He stepped forward, his jacket held out to her, but before he could get there, the dream went black. The blonde awoke with a growl and his nails grew into claws as he launched out of bed and gave in to his desire to tear into something. The wall beside his bed was the unfortunate victim as his claws ripped through the dry wall in 4 neat rows. He brought his left hand down against the wall and repeated the mark except it was diagonally opposite. He clenched his fists tightly, hard enough to break the skin, and blood dripped from his hands as he struggled to control himself. He had to remind himself that it was just a dream and he slowly began to calm down. His nails retreated back to their normal size and the puncture wounds they created in his palms started to close up rapidly. As his head cleared and his eyes returned to their normal shade, he sighed and slumped against the wall. What was up with him and dreaming about Aella? And why were they always so horrible? He shook his head slowly as his headache came back full force. But this time it was more of a migraine. The pain intensified when he tried to think back on the dream. He noticed, for the first time, something strange. When he thought back on them he could barely understand what they were saying. They weren't speaking English, but when he was dreaming he could understand them perfectly. It made his head hurt. Literally. He sighed and made his way to the bathroom. Maybe a shower would make his head hurt less. After he had taken a shower he had gone searching through the city to find a liquor store that sold sake. It was Saturday and Saturday was his get drunk and reminisce day. Ah, finally. He spotted one and he grinned as he parked and walked into the store. A few minutes later he walked out with a couple boxes of high-quality sake. Now to get to his favorite spot. He drove home, parked, made a few clones to carry the cases, and then he and his clones disappeared in an orange flash. The group of doppelgangers appeared at the top of one of the towers on the Golden Gate Bridge. The clones set down the alcohol, which somehow didn't fall off even in the high winds. They dispersed and Naruto completely cut off Kurama's chakra from his system so he could actually get drunk. He then began drinking and reminiscing. 2 hours or so and a few cases of sake later, Naruto was sufficiently drunk. But only drunk enough so that all the things that he had purposefully repressed came back to the forefront of his mind. Old friends and teachers being amongst the most common ones. He missed Kiba and Lee. Those two were some of his closest friends back in the village. At least the ones that were still alive. Well, he assumed they were still alive. He hadn't been gone long enough for them to have died of old age. At last he thought so, maybe time moved differently in this place. He also missed Konohamaru and his crew. He sincerely hoped that he was still alive and that he had made his move with Hanabi. He didn't need to make the same mistake that Naruto had when it came to that family. But really, the person that he missed the most was Tsunade. After she was killed, Tsunade was the only one there who was really able to comfort him. After the war ended and he killed Sasuke, he had spent a lot of his time with the old hag. They became close. He stopped calling her Granny Tsunade and, much to her secret delight, started calling her Mom. He really missed her company. They usually couldn't stand each other, but right now, he could honestly say that he missed his mama. He took another swig of his sake and looked into the sunset. He tried to smile, but it quickly dipped into a frown as tears formed at the rim of his eyes and slowly began their journey down his face. Somewhere else in a different world, a certain busty blonde Hokage was sitting on her own stone head as she looked into the sunset. She was shakily drinking her sake as tears rolled down her cheeks. She heard someone land behind her and she didn't even turn around. "Have you found anything new, Neji?" said Hyuga, stiffened before nodding. "Actually yes. It appears that he was working on some kind of seal. I don't understand them, but it looked similar to the one on this kunai." He threw a tri-pronged kunai to his leader and she caught it by the handle before studying it closely. She chuckled once before growling, "That stupid brat. Why was he messing with this seal? I forbid him from doing so until he fully understood how it worked." Neji tilted his head before asking dumbly, "What exactly is it?" Tsunade chucked the kunai back to Neji. "That is the Flying Thunder God seal marker, Neji. It was the jutsu that allowed the fourth to defeat Iwa in almost a single battle. It allows the user to teleport instantly to the place where that kunai is." Naruto wanted to be able to do it without the kunai. And he succeeded. But it wasn't perfect, so he wanted to tweak the seal. Neji was a smart guy and he put the dots together, and you think that his tampering with the seal was what caused him to disappear. "That is exactly what I think," Tsunade stated. "Send out the messages through the villages. They deserve to know." "Know what exactly?" "That Naruto is missing in action. Probably gone forever. Why not tell them that he is dead?" Tsunade chuckled and her tears flowed anew, because heroes like him never die. Never. Besides, he told himself that he was supposed to be martyr anyway. Neji just nodded and disappeared into the night. Back at the bridge, Naruto had finally ran out of sake and he was beginning to nod off. He knew that he should probably get back to his house, but the red steel was actually feeling pretty comfortable. He wiped the tears from his eyes and then they closed. Normally this wouldn't be a problem. But he hadn't unlocked Kurama's chakra. So as the air and wind grew colder, so did his body. Because he was remarkably more human without the fox. Ayala approached a tall man with silver hair and a long beard. She fell into step beside the man, and whispered, "Daddy?" He turned to look down on his daughter. "Ayala, I'm busy, can you make it quick? Ares hurt me. In the gardens. He pinned me down and..." She broke off, tears in her eyes. Her father frowned. "Did he leave bruises?" She nodded. "Let me see." Her father growled, and she showed him her hips, her throat and her elbows, purple and blue with bruises. Her father's eyes widened as he shook his head sadly. "My darling, I'm so glad he didn't hurt you further." She looked away, ashamed, as her brother walked into the room, casting bronze flashes all over the place. Her father clapped the younger man on the shoulder and started laughing. "I couldn't have done better, and boy." Ayala looked up, confused. "You're proud of him?" His eyes flashed like lightning, the glow remaining after the initial strike. "Why wouldn't I be? He's following in his father's footsteps, taking his sister for his own, making her feel small, showing her who is the man in their relationship. We don't have a relationship. I'm too young. You do now, Ayala, and stop crying about it. It was meant to be this way." Ayala shook her head, taking great shuddering breaths. "You're lying. It's not okay for him to hurt me. It's not okay." Her father snarled. "Stop this instant, Ayala. Or do I have to call your mother?" Ayala trembled in her sandals and shook her head no. "Pete, place please, not mother." "Then stop crying. Your nose is running like a fountain. Get out of my sight." She inhaled sharply. "You're supposed to help me." Her father rounded on her, a bolt of lightning forming in his palm in a threat. "You're talking to your king, Ayala." She ran, fleeing from his sight, and out into the gardens, fleeing well beyond the boundaries she normally would, tears streaming off her face and onto the ground. She came to a rest at the entrance to the top of the mountain, looking behind her as she ran, convinced her brother was following her. But suddenly, she ran face first into a wall of black bricks. Someone caught her by the arm, and she screamed, wrenching free. "Don't touch me. I don't wanna. Go away." The man in black recoiled. "Ayala, it's just me." His voice was dark and eerie, and if Naruto listened closely, he could hear an echo as if someone else repeated the man. He knelt down to Ayala and narrowed his eyes. "Who touched you, Ayala? I'll rip his hands off." He gently touched her throat, and she recoiled from him. "You're cold?" Naruto agreed with her. Since he first sensed the presence of the man, there was something irrationally wrong with him. He smelled of mildew and rotting things, and his movement mimicked either a burial shroud falling over a body, or the strange, jerky movements of something strange one would find under a rock. His clothes were tattered, and the helm on his head made both the Leaf Shinobi and the pale girl recoil with terror. There was something in those dark eyes that pulled forward the childhood memories of the monsters under the bed and the eyes in the closet. He touched Ayala again and she recoiled. She whispered to him, "Daddy was going to hit me." "But Artaxias, Ares," he corrected gently. "Ares, she broke down into tears. The man gathered her into her arms and rubbed her back, her tears staining his dark robes silver with salt. The day and scenery abruptly changed. She was watching her father talk to the man in dark clothes. She was hidden behind a column, her eyes glowing in the dark. "You cannot condone that kind of behavior, Zeus. She's only 14 by human standards." "And he raped her." The man with dark clothes was defending her. She smiled softly, her eyes hopeful. Her father snarled, "I can and I will. She needs to learn." "Learn what? You rotten son of a bitch. That she's a worthless piece of shit with 3 holes and that's all she's good for? No child deserves that." A voice behind Ayala whispered. "Oh, but you do." She spun, eyes flashing. A piece of rough cloth was pressed against her nose and mouth. She struggled, but soon enough her eyes rolled back into her head and she collapsed into his arms. She didn't even get a chance to scream. Ayala roared, tearing at the silk that surrounded her, her body morphing into something that was decidedly not human. She tore out of her bedroom, eyes flashing from amber to red to ice blue, as her arms elongated and she dropped to all fours, nose elongating and ear turning into sharp, angled points. She jumped from the banister at the top of a flight of stairs to the bottom step before rounding on the stairs, backing away from them on 4 feet, her bushy tail stuck between her legs, but otherwise angry, aggressive, and ready to fight, her teeth sharp and begging to be stained by blood. There was a noise behind her, a drag of fabric on the slick marble floors, and she reacted on adrenaline, her maw open wide and claws out. She attacked the dark shadow of a man, pushing him to the ground with a resounding rumble that was most definitely felt in the city above, tearing at his shoulder as he roared with fury and pain, until gold blood trickled to the floor and made her fur glitter in the light from the torches. A staff of onyx came swinging at her head, and she ducked, snarling. When it came at her again, didn't move, but disappeared in a puff of silver smoke, then reappeared standing a few feet away from her uncle, her animalistic form gone. She still growled, however, still crouched close to the ground, her eyes red and angry, but also scared. The god of the dead stood, rolling his shoulders angrily. He frowned down at her, his eyes, which were normally green, had turned pitch black. She cowered, getting so low to the ground her belly brushed the floor. He took a deep breath, looking down on his niece with fires of rage flickering behind his gaze. "Get out of my sight, Ayala. I didn't mean." His features turned demonic, and he snarled with a low, monster-like timbre to his voice. "Don't make me tell you twice." She fled out into Asphodel, until she was back by the banks of the Lethe, shaking. Although, it was kind of hard to tell whether she was shaking, or the ground was, as it vibrated so furiously in accordance with her uncle's rage. She curled up into a ball, thinking deeply. There was a little voice that twittered in the back of her head, trying to get her attention. She pushed it away more than once, but it kept coming back, nagging away at the base of her skull. She gasped as her vision was taken from her, and she got still frame flashes. The Golden Gate Bridge, bottles of liquor, the bridge rocking fascinatingly in the high winds and the minor earthquake. A bundle of clothes curled up on one of the towers, perilously close to the edge, a man with a bottle clutched in his hands. The flashes zoomed in on his face, taking sport shots as he rolled over. The blonde from the coffee shop, his eyes closed. He was shivering. He rolled for the edge again, the bottle falling from his hands and down to the highway below. And he kept rolling. She vanished in a puff of silver smoke, heading for the Golden Gate Bridge, praying he wouldn't fall. She grabbed him by the back of the shirt and hauled him back onto the bright orange iron, shaking herself. There was a split second of terror as his eyelids fluttered and she recoiled, hiding from him behind a decorative spire. He groaned and curled into a fetal position. "Tsunade." He whimpered, "Mom." Ayala felt her eyes narrow, peeking out from her hiding spot. He coughed and shivered again, his skin pale and ashen. She reached out for the sense of animal power that ran through him, and found nothing. Not even a thread that connected the two. She frowned and knelt next to him, gently touching his arm. He was stone cold, and brushed her hand away, shivering. She snarled, as the wind picked up again, whipping her hair around her face. It felt like it was about 40 degrees. She touched his temple and closed her eyes, searching for his address. Not to be creepy or anything, but he was only mortal. They had this weird body-regulating temperature in case they got too cold. And in his case, he needed to get inside. She smiled, took his hand and the pair of them vanished, leaving the bottles behind. They reappeared in a 3-bedroom apartment that had been painted in neutral, clean colors. He was wasted. She could smell it on him, and he really needed to bathe. He smiled, and hugged her tightly, and she pushed him away. He fell down and she looked on him with disgust. Ambrosia and nectar never made her act like that. He blinked awake, and she became a little white fox, curled up beneath his desk. He groaned, looking around, his eyes groggy and lined with veins. He stumbled through several doors and she followed him on 4 paws, watching as he collapsed into a bed with black and orange covers. She jumped up onto his back and he laughed into his pillow. Her tail swished back and forth, and she rolled her eyes. She pranced up to his head and licked his cheek. He pushed her off the bed and she fell to the ground with a yelp. She snarled, returning to her mortal form, "Well, screw you too." He was out cold. There was no way she was going to get a response. She shoved him once, then twice for good measure. "Idiot." She walked out of the room, snapped her fingers, leaving him clean and undressed with his clothes folded neatly at the foot of the bed. He rolled over and whimpered. "Ayala." She froze and turned to face him. "What do you need? A hug?" "No you don't. Please?" "No." He whimpered. "Don't be mean." She sighed and returned to his bedside, trying desperately not to think that most of his clothes were already off. She hugged him gently, his arms wrapping around her too. She left abruptly, unaware she had left her scent in every room she had been in and on everything she had touched. Naruto woke up slowly and instantly regretted the action. The hangover he hadn't been expecting was in full swing and his head was pounding. He groaned and reached within himself to start releasing Kurama's chakra back into his system. The blonde felt better immediately as his body was filled with warmth and the headache all but disappeared. He grinned and patted his stomach. "You know Kurama. You're an asshole but I sure do love you, buddy." He could almost hear the fox cursing his name with less than acceptable language. He chuckled and got up from his bed. That's when things started getting weird. First off, he was naked. That was always bad, but he was in his apartment, so it was okay. But that was the second problem. He distinctly remembered that in his drunken haze, he had fallen asleep on the bridge. So how in Sam's hell did he get back in his house? He growled in annoyance. His ninja skills were failing without anything to sharpen them on. Even if he was drunk, he should have been able to notice something touching him. And it had to be a something. What human could have found him up there? He shook his head and proceeded to grab his clothes. He put on some blue jeans, a white t-shirt, and an orange hoodie. It wasn't cold outside at all, but he was going to Freddy's house, and that man obviously liked his apartment just above freezing. You know, just in case his guests ever got a little bit warm. He put on some coffee and waited patiently. As soon as it was ready, Naruto poured himself a cup and fixed it up just the way he liked it. He took a big whiff and frowned. The coffee smelled great, but his apartment did not. There was someone else's scent in his house. And it was quite familiar because the person's younger self had been haunting his dreams for the better portion of a year. Ayla. That woman had been all over his house, touching his stuff. Normally he wouldn't care, but he had some pretty incriminating stuff in his apartment. His office, for one, had all his drafts and copies of his books. That wasn't fan material, and it would be quite obvious. And his storage room also had quite the variety of ninja tools, such as kunai and shuriken. He couldn't just explain that away as home defense. Grr, why was that woman so infuriating and so interesting at the same time? He couldn't decide whether he wanted to choke her or sit down and chat for a while. Ah, fuck it, Naruto said in exasperation. He grabbed his keys and cup of coffee before heading out of his front door. She was nowhere around, so he couldn't do either of those things. Maybe he could talk to Freddy about it. It was about 15 minutes later that Naruto found himself picking Freddy's door open. He honestly didn't know why his friend kept changing the locks. He didn't need a key anyway. Click. Ah, there it was. Naruto picked his rather large cup of coffee back up and silently moved into Freddy's hallway. He could hear voices coming from the living room. He crept up to the doorway and leaned against the frame before taking another sip of his coffee. Freddy was sitting in an ottoman chair across from Akila, who was sitting on the couch, and they appeared to be arguing rather heatedly about something. And they didn't seem to notice Naruto standing there. So why would he interrupt? That would be rude. Frederick Chase, don't you dare make me explain this again. Akila, they're the same. Both are narrow-bladed weapons with ornate pommels. Rapiers and epées are not the same. She stood and turned away, her gray eyes dark and rolling like storm clouds. She turned back to Freddy and put on a pouty face that made him sigh and go over to her, gently touching her shoulder. Don't be like that, they're still different. She turned up her nose and crossed her arms. You're impossible. Freddy smiled and wrapped his arms around her teasingly. He chuckled, I know. His voice got soft, and Akila looked suddenly uncomfortable as they got very close, physically. He whispered in her ear. They're the same. She elbowed him back to the ottoman, laughing. They are not, and you know it. A rapier is a blade with a rectangular base and 2 sharpened edges. An epée is a blade with a square base, 4 slightly sharpened edges and a blunted tip. Rapiers can and will draw blood. Epées are used in their place in stage productions because you're pretty hard-pressed to draw blood with an epée. Freddy was sitting in his ottoman, leaned back with his head supported by one hand. The other hand had all 4 fingers and the thumb pressed together, mimicking a mouth as it blabbed on pointlessly. She saw this and her eyes narrowed. He grinned softly. They're the same. She frowned and grabbed a long-stemmed flower from an artificial bouquet and extended it in front of her, her feet making a perfect L as her arm arched behind and over her head for balance. En garde, vous petit garçon. He grabbed another and mimicked her stance with some initial balance issues, but soon the two were locked in a duel. Akila shouting out her attacks as she went, throwing Freddy off his game. Croisé, lunge, riposte, kakil, remise. Freddy reached out with his other arm and grabbed her waist, laughing as he drew her close to him, trapping their blades between their bodies. She screamed, pounding on his shoulder with frustration, her eyes playful. Core, let me go. Freddy smirked and kissed her, unexpectedly. She flushed bright red, casting her gray eyes away. Naruto snickered softly, still sipping on his coffee. She muttered under her breath, something about an appointment, and left in an unexplained hurry, gathering her things and nearly bolting from the apartment, her facey color of a boiled lobster. Naruto chuckled and sat down on the arm of Freddy's ottoman and picked up Akila's abandoned flower stem. He smacked Freddy on the arm with it, then looked at him seriously. Do I get a kiss, too, now Freddy? Freddy blushed but planted his palm in the blonde's face and shoved him off the chair. Shut up, Naruto. Ah, don't be like that Fredward, Naruto replied cheekily with a pout on his face. Freddy groaned. How the hell do you keep getting in my house? Seriously. It was getting ridiculous. Where in the hell do you keep getting the money to buy new locks for me to pick? Naruto retorted with a smirk. Freddy grinned. He enjoyed their banter. Well, it's not my fault you're a criminal. Hey, I take offense to that. I'm a ninja. There is a difference, Naruto responded indignantly. Freddy just laughed before he got serious. In all seriousness, Naruto. What brings you here today? You usually don't stop by for no reason. Naruto sighed before sitting down on the couch. His face was grim and a little sad. Well, it's about that girl I told you about. Freddy's face changed a little bit. It became more serious than just a guy talking to his friend. It was something deeper than that. He whistled. The same one from the coffee shop? Yep. Well, what eating you about her? Naruto thought for a second. He couldn't just say that he was having dreams about her that involved the Greek gods. That was a little much even for him. He hadn't even told his friend about the whole coffee shop incident. Only the first part, so he decided to tweak the situation a bit. It would still provide for almost the same conversation. He looked at Freddy and rubbed his eyes. Well, for one, I can't stop thinking about her. Hell, I even dream about her? Wow, that sounds serious. Do you like her? Naruto nodded, but then he shook his head. Yes? No? I don't know. I've hardly talked to the girl. He thought back to how he mysteriously appeared in his house and how her scent was everywhere inside of it. I mean, I've seen her around and we keep running into each other, but when we do she hardly talks to me. But she makes it seem like she is interested. Freddy scratched his chin. You say you can't stop thinking about her? He got a nod. And you think that she seems interested in you? Another nod. Well, why don't you ask her out? Naruto sighed in exasperation. I never get the chance. She is always disappearing to one place or another. I literally haven't talked to her for more than 5 minutes. Freddy chuckled. Well, you know, Christmas and New Year's are just around the corner. Some buddies that I know from college are throwing a party for New Year's. If you come, then maybe she'll be there. Freedy, Naruto groaned. Seriously, Naruto, you need to get out of that office. A party would do you good. Just think about it. And if you see the girl again, ask if she wants to go. It couldn't hurt, Freddy stated. Naruto rolled it over in his head. On one hand, a party would be nice. On the other hand, Ayala might not show up again and he wouldn't be able to talk to her. Oh, well, this seemed like one of those things that you could enforce. Fine, I'll think about it. With that said, Naruto got up and stretched. Freddy nodded. Good. Now get your blonde ass out of my house. Love you, too, Freddy. He had told her that her training was complete. Ares was no longer her big brother, but the master of her desires, introducing her to diverse and twisted fetishes. He indulged himself too often, and his slave had decided to rebel. She was tired of being twisted into pretzels, told she could only melt into ecstasy when told, when her master was dominant and particularly male, tired of being tied and cut into, indulging in a fetish she particularly hated, where he sliced through her thin mortal skin to lap at the blood that flowed from the wound. Blood play. Lovely little thing. And the way she was going to get out of here. He left the knife last time he was here, and it was now concealed beneath the dozens of lavish pillows she lounged in, smiling prettily as the door opened and he entered, flustered. On your knees. She obeyed, the knife concealed in her hands, which were clasped tightly behind her back like the little submissive bitch she was. When told to start using her hands, she inhaled sharply, and slashed violently with the knife bared in her left hand. His blood was salty and filled her nostrils with a metallic scent. He struck her, sending the knife skittering across the room as he gruffly pawed at her barely matured curves. Lay down, Ayala, and maybe it won't hurt so much. The concept of pain and domination made her melt and she whimpered, clutching at his forearm, for which she was rewarded with by a fist that broke her cheekbone. Who said you could, you little whore? Get on your knees. She stood defiantly. No. She thought she saw fear swim in his eyes. Now, no. Ayala started out of the dream, her eyes blood red in anticipation. She sighed and sat up, frowning in disappointment. She wanted to castrate him with her teeth again. Bastard. Take away her innocence and then train his own little sister to be his own little toy. Her demonstration of brutality had allowed her godly form to come through, a fox-like, demonic creature with ice-blue eyes. She smiled, remembering her trial, then the decision on where she would live. She was too dark for Olympus, so her uncle adopted her, and now she lived beneath the ground, dwelling in the lovely, beautiful underworld. She stretched and inhaled deeply, then frowned. There was a visitor who traveled in a chariot decorated with roses and pulled by sparkly pink pegasi. Ew. She dressed quickly and quietly in simple clothes before creeping down the stairs, praying that her uncle wouldn't hear her. The throne room doors were open, and he sat high and mighty, staring impatiently down at a perfect specimen of a woman, who was dressed like a Playboy bunny. Ayala caught her uncle's eye, waving frantically. She mouthed to him, her eyes desperate. "Don't make me talk to her," she mimed furiously, acting out her silent plea for his silence. He arched an eyebrow, nearly unnoticeable, but Ayala sighed and went down on her knees, her hands clasped in front of her, begging. The corner of his mouth twitched and he waved her away with his eyes, a small smirk decorating his face. She ran out the front doors and disappeared, heading for one of her favorite places in Old Frisco. The zoo, and the display of gray foxes. She circumvented the main gates, smiling at a security guard who looked at her suspiciously. She waited until he passed her before focusing her dynami on him, and he started to speak Klingon to all the guests, who weren't sure if they were being mocked or if his meds had worn off. She wound her way through the exhibits until she sat on the edge of the fox exhibit, watching them play and frolic without a care in the world. She smiled, and waited until there was no one else around before starting up a conversation with them. Barks, yelps and cries that, to the casual observer, came from the foxes, not from the woman that was leaning over the railing with a smile on her face and good nature in her eyes. Ayala, you came back. The foxes gathered below her, yipping happily, tails swishing through the light morning fog. Did you bring treats? The chant started up, clamoring from many muzzles. Treats, treats, we want treats. She laughed, looking around to make sure no one was watching, before tossing 2 handfuls of her little pink treats into the enclosure, smiling as they were gobbled up by the younger foxes, who bolted away to the other side of the enclosure, barking and yapping at another visitor, laughing when he couldn't understand them. A dark gray fox emerged from the brush below her, and Ayala inclined her head with respect. The fox copied her motion, and when they met eyes, amber to bright orange, Ayala was the one to lower her eyes first. The fox chuckled, its voice harsh and deep. "What's wrong? You never come around unless you need to talk to me." Ayala sighed. "Wilmer." She hesitated and then sighed once more. "I rescued a man from the top of the Golden Gate Bridge." The fox arched an eyebrow. "Why?" She shrugged. "I was at home, and then I got visions of him rolling off the edge and I grabbed the back of shirt before I knew I had transported there." Wilmer snickered, but gestured with his tail for her to continue. "What's so funny?" she asked indignantly. "It's not important yet," he chuckled. "What happened next?" She shrugged. "I took his drunk ass home and put him in bed." She frowned. "I hugged him, but that's not important." The younger foxes were barking up at another visitor, insulting him, laughing when he didn't understand and didn't react. Wilmer frowned, looking at the younger foxes, and at the visitor they were pestering. Is there anything different about him? Compared to an average human? Is there anything strange or different about him? Ayala inhaled deeply. There's something different about him. She shivered. Powerful. The fox nodded, baring his teeth at the other visitor. Go on, Ayala. I don't really know. I've interacted with him for maybe half an hour. We've maybe exchanged 24 words. She sighed and placed her head in her hands. You're so Twitter-pated. What? Twitter-pated? The hell is Twitter-pated? There was a harsh bark and the young foxes wailed and ran back to Wilmer. He understands. Wilmer snarled down at the kids. This is why insulting people isn't funny. They meekly tucked their bushy tails between their legs. Ayala snarled. Who? He who? They pointed with their noses to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man. Ayala's eyes widened then narrowed. She snarled and he walked around to her side of the pavilion, the younger foxes disappearing into the bushes. Wilmer yowled up at the man as he came closer. Get lost. She doesn't need someone like you little chit. She's fine on her own. Ayala turned her face away so the blonde couldn't see her blush. Wilmer was more of a dad than her father ever was. The man met Wilmer's eyes directly and snarled a challenge. Wilmer did something Ayala had never seen him do. He tucked his tail between his legs, flattened his ears and backed away, not meeting the man's eyes. He backed all the way into the brush, where he disappeared. Ayala whispered, "Goodbye, Wilmer." She sighed and turned away, meaning to walk away, but a question stopped her. "Ayala, do you remember me?" She froze and turned back to him, his eyes guarded. She nodded. "Why, yes." He smiled. "I remember you." She laughed. "Well, I deduced that, Sherlock." He gestured to the fox pit. "You can talk to them?" She nodded. He frowned and looked into the pit. No foxes to be found. "What is twitterpated?" She shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine." She turned and walked away. Something nagged at her to go back, but she kept walking, her back ridged. He was dangerous and she knew it. The animal in him was back, not like that night a few weeks ago, when she had done her impromptu rescue. She heard footsteps behind her, and she grew tense. "Ayala, wait." He grabbed her arm, just above her tattoo, and she lost it. She screamed, rounded on him, and grabbed his wrist, yanking it away from her arm as she spun away from him. Then as she was getting ready to flip him, she couldn't move. He would not lift off the ground, and she couldn't move her lower body. She had successfully spun herself into his arms, and he had pinned her close to him, immobilizing her legs by trapping them in his own. She started shaking with terror, and closed her eyes, trying to push away the memories that threatened to engulf her. He released her, and she put a solid 5 feet between them, staring at her feet. He asked quietly, "Do you want to go get coffee?" "On me. Don't grab me like that." "I won't, I swear." "Okay, you can trust me." She snarled, "Prove it." "I'm trying to. But you were rather hard to trust, too. You were in my apartment. Don't you dare get accusatory on me. You were drunk as a skunk and about to fall to your death. You were in my apartment." His tone was even and hard to read, but his eyes were not angry or accusatory, but curious. "Why?" She had no answer. She looked away. He moved so their eyes met again. "Coffee? Maybe they'll get my order right this time." That coaxed a smile out of her. "Fine." She'd make sure they didn't. He sighed. "Why is it that every time I'm in a coffee shop with you they mess up my order?" Ayala smiled quietly to herself, reaching for the coffee that was on the bench above her. He was sitting on the bench, she lay in the grass beside it, enjoying the tickle of the soft blades on her skin. She watched him eye the mocha latte with disgust. "It's like a chocolate bar in a cup," he complained. "Just drink it." She had his espresso, and hated the bitterness of it, but enjoyed his distaste. It was funny. He set it down, and she put her coffee back on the bench, smiling as the cherry blossom tree they were sitting under shook some petals free in the wind. The Yerba Buena Gardens had a few of the exotic trees, and she enjoyed the smell of them. "So," he started, turning to look at her, She sat up, putting her chin in her hands. "What's up?" "Nothing." He grabbed a coffee and took a sip, his eyes narrowing. "You had my coffee the entire time, didn't you?" She smirked, and took off, running down the path and climbing into a tree. When she sat on a large branch to stop for a rest, he was already there, leaning against the trunk of the tree. She jumped when she saw him. "That's not funny." "It's hilarious. I'm laughing so hard." He jumped at her and she flinched backward, falling out of the tree. She landed on her back, which drove all the breath out of her. He smiled and reached one hand down to help her up. She took it, and he smiled, pulling her to her feet. His hands were firm and sure, they did not shake. She tried to pull away gently, but in doing so, their fingers laced together and she froze. He smiled at her and she let her hand stay there for a while, before pulling away, breaking the contact. She walked back to their bench, where they discovered a homeless man drinking their coffee. She sighed and turned away, walking in the other direction. He followed beside her, gently brushing his hand against hers. She drew her hand away. "Sorry." He shrugged. "Don't worry about it." Eventually, darkness fell, and they ended up outside Naruto's apartment building. He smiled. "Thanks." "For what?" "Trusting me for the day." She turned away, waving goodbye. "I'll see you later, I guess." He took her hand, drawing her back, gently. She didn't freak out, but let it happen, still scared on the inside. He said, "A buddy of mine is throwing a party on New Year's Eve." He smiled at her. "Could you make time in your oh-so-busy schedule to show up?" She handed him a piece of paper in response. "What's that?" She took it back from him, peering at it, holding it close to her eyes, then at arm's length. She put it back in his hands. "My address and phone number." He laughed, and tucked it into his pocket. She pulled away, but he didn't let go, pulling her back into his arms. She whispered, "Please let me go. One more thing first." He lowered his head then hesitated. "Do you trust me?" She nodded. "Yes." Freddy, looking out his window from a nearby building, smirked. She walked away blushing, as Naruto stuck his hands in his pockets and walked into his building with a smile on his face. Freddy closed the curtains with a chuckle. "I knew you would land her." Naruto was starting to understand what being Twitter-pated meant. He couldn't concentrate on anything and he felt weird. It wasn't like it was with her. This seemed more spontaneous and less certain. But that was what he loved about it. He literally didn't know where this was headed. They both knew the other wasn't normal but neither seemed to care. And he hadn't talked to her very much since the day at the zoo. Sure, they had spoken over the phone, but it wasn't quite the same as speaking face to face. But on the flip side of that coin, the dreams had been coming to him more often and they were getting worse. He didn't understand them and he didn't mention them to Ayala. How do you even begin to talk about something like that? He was sure that he couldn't just call her up and start talking about her horrible childhood that may or may not be figments of his imagination. He didn't understand them, but one thing he knew was that the dreams certainly added up with why she didn't like to be touched. That was a fact that angered and bewildered him to no end. All of her body language and social responses suggested that the events in the dream really did take place. But Naruto's logical side refused to accept that. How could she possibly be affiliated with Greek gods that were supposed to just be made-up legends? But that was when the smart side of Naruto's brain kicked the logical side in the face. If his father was able to call up the death god to seal Kurama in his stomach, then why couldn't the Greek gods exist? If two worlds that were entirely separate from each other could exist at the same time, then why couldn't a few overpowered humanoids sit upon their thrones and mess around with the lives of mortals? In any case, Naruto vowed that he wouldn't mention it until she brought up his weirdness first. She would start asking questions sooner or later. Hopefully. But he didn't need to worry about that today because today was in fact New Year's Eve. The night of the party. The night when half of the civilized world got collectively drunk. Naruto absently wondered why ninjas didn't have a celebration like this. He was sure that if Tsunade caught wind of it, that it would become a village festival in a heartbeat. The thought made him smile, but it also made him a little sad. What should I wear? Naruto asked himself as he looked into his closet. He sat there for a while before he snapped his fingers and walked into his storage room. He danced around some boxes and avoided the kunai and shuriken that were in neat rows on the floor before he came to one measly little storage scroll that was sitting in a lonely corner. He spread it out and found the one thing that he was looking for. He pushed some chakra into the neat kanji and out poofed an orange hoodie. But it wasn't just any orange hoodie. It was a hoodie that she had given him for his 17th birthday. The hood of it even had little fox ears that poked up when he put the hood on. He smiled sadly and slipped it on over his head. It still smelled like her. And that was a bittersweet scent. He pulled on his pants and socks before setting his alarm clock and curling up on his couch to sleep. He twisted the hoodie slightly so he could bury his nose into the fabric. He was asleep and dreaming happy dreams that he would regret remembering later. Several hours later, after the sun had already dipped down below the horizon, Naruto found himself walking into the bar where Freddy directed him to. As he entered, he cut off Kurama's chakra from himself again. He didn't really plan on getting wasted, but he did want to enjoy himself. He would have to talk to the fox soon anyway. It would be nice to speak to someone from his old home. In fact, it was weird that the fox had been so silent anyway. Also, in a spurt of braveness, Naruto decided to drop the illusion that was keeping his whisker marks hidden. It would be funny to see how people reacted to them. As he walked in, he looked around for Freddy. But Freddy found him first. His said man draped an arm over the blonde shoulders and steered him over to a table. Sitting at the table were about 6 guys that Naruto didn't know. One of them was a burly guy who stood up and sized the blonde up. "This is the guy you were telling us about, Freddy. He barely looks old enough to drink." Freddy chuckled in response. "Trust me. The kid can drink. A lot. And he's cool. Not as smart as us, but cool." Naruto frowned and slapped his friend over the head. "I can be smart when the situation calls for it." One of the other guys was the first one to see the abnormal marking on the blonde's cheeks. He called it out and Naruto looked at him in false surprise before making an "aw" noise. "Oh, these?" He got multiple nods. "I'm pretty sure that they are birthmarks." I've had them ever since I was a baby. The girls seem to like them though. He got a few skeptical looks and laughs. He put on a pout and then a challenging face. Oh, you don't believe me? Watch this. He pulled the hood on over his head so the ears poked out and put on his most dazzling smile before unleashing it on the table of girls that were sitting across the bar. He was praying that they didn't laugh or he'd lose all credibility. But they didn't laugh. A few of them blushed and started to whisper quietly among themselves and the others just smiled back. He turned back towards the guys with a triumphant grin. Told you, he said in a smug tone. The burly man, now named Dave, smirked. Okay kid. You were able to get the attention of college girls with all that orange, so I guess you're okay. Now let's see if the baby fox can hold his own at the partying game. Naruto smirked back. He didn't mind the nickname. It fit, sorta. And so they partied. It was fun. He drank a few beers and flirted with a few girls. But he always kept his eye out for the face that he really wanted to see. But she didn't show up. At least for the first hour and a half. But that was when Naruto got up to go relieve himself. Maybe she would be there when he returned. Ayala felt very, very uncomfortable. When she learned that it was to be a bar party and not a house party, she nearly backed out of the invitation. Too many people too close to her, too many ways for her relive her experiences with her brother in some desolate back alley. So she brought Dan, her nephew, but both of them knew in public that he was her older brother. His aura made people stay away from them, his eyes dark and his skin pale. He frowned, looking around. Ayala, are you sure you aren't being set up? You've been here for nearly 10 minutes. She turned over her shoulder, a snarl on her face. Have you ever thought perhaps that the "don't come close unless you want to die" vibe may have something to do with that? He took a swing of nectar out of a silver flask, eyes narrowed. I don't want you to get hurt. He rolled his shoulders and whined. The leather jacket makes my feathers itchy. She growled. I'm wearing stilettos and you're complaining about your feathers being itchy. Just be quiet and be my bouncer. He sighed and offered her the flask. She shook her head, her amber eyes looking for Naruto. Where the hell could he be? Then traced her shoulder blade with his corpse-cold fingers. She jumped, and he smirked. I like this one. You had a good artist. The dragon on her right shoulder she had put there to cover a nasty scar, just like the other one on her left arm and in the small of her back. She sighed and put her head in her hands, watching the bar keep mixed drinks. She waited for another few minutes before getting tapped on the shoulder. It wasn't then, who was awkwardly trying to get a very, very drunk girl off his arm. She turned to look over her shoulder, and got a face full of cosplay fox. Complete with whiskers and ears. The blue eyes sparkled enthusiastically. You made it. She blinked at him, and laughed. What are you wearing? He shrugged, and smiled at her, and as she turned to get Then's attention, she felt his eyes rove over her. It wasn't hostile or with bad intentions, but made her feel more than a little uncomfortable. Then turned, and she sensed Naruto go on edge. She tried to diffuse the situation, making quick introductions. Then, this is Naruto. Then frowned, sizing the blonde up, his dark eyes unimpressed. She turned to Naruto, who looked even more on edge now, having taken up a casual but threatening stance. She thought she could hear Then's eyebrows rise. Naruto, this is my older brother, Then. Naruto frowned, and his hands slowly traveled to his pocket, eyes narrowing dangerously. He bared his teeth and growled, rather loudly, before taking her hand and gently, but forcefully, pulled her close and put her behind his back. She thought she saw the glitter of a blade emerge from both men's pockets and she cleared her throat. Then snapped out of it, and stood, towering at nearly 6.5 feet tall. He said gruffly, keep your cup covered and call me if things get. His eyes narrowed at Naruto, and Ayala could tell he was laughing on the inside about the ears. Out of control. He headed for the door, and she stiffened as he took off the leather jacket at the door, revealing raven's wings that extended from his shoulders to his tailbone. He looked over his shoulder, winked and then disappeared in a blast of cold air. Naruto stood, and said softly, we're sitting at a table not too far away. He smiled down on her and she pushed back the hood, her fingers traveling over the whiskers. She was surprised when they didn't smudge. She pressed a little harder and he laughed at her confusion. They're birthmarks, Ayala. They aren't going to come off. She crossed her arms, but her eyes traveled over them curiously. I like them. They look kinda like war paint. He gently took her hand. Come meet the guys. She trembled at the contact, but when they laced fingers and he let her press her arm to his, she felt some control return to her side. "Boys, look, baby Fox landed himself a foxy lady." That came from a burly man who had drunk just a tad too much. His face was a little red, and he laughed at his joke like it was the best thing he had heard all year. The other guys around the table guffawed at the joke, and Ayala suddenly felt very, very outnumbered. She took a step back, and when something brushed against her knees, she sat down on a reflex. She blinked in surprise when she realized she had been tucked into the table. Naruto smiled. "Guys, Freddy, this is Ayala." Freddy looked at Ayala and winked surreptitiously at her. "He's been doing some hardcore griping over you. He isn't always this suave. Don't let him fool you." Naruto snarled. "Hey, I didn't spill the beans about you to Aquila." A woman dressed in a loose-fitting silver dress that gathered at her bust line. Ayala recognized her on the spot, and her eyes went red around the edges. Aquila sat next to Freddy, smiling, before she was introduced to Ayala. Both of them reacted in the same way. They took deep breaths, and blinked furiously to conceal the way their eyes were changing. It was quite clear to the guys around the table that the two girls had a history. Aquila, Ayala. The greetings were civil enough, but Ayala could feel herself giving way to the chaos. She gently pulled her hand out of Naruto's, kicking her stilettos off beneath the table, folding her legs beneath her. Aquila mirrored the movements, her eyes narrowing. Just as the discussion about football was getting serious, both girls collided in the air over the table and started screaming. Glass shattered, hair was pulled, and alcohol stained both girls' dresses. Ayala folded beneath Aquila, who screamed at her. "How dare you? You abandoned him when he needed you most." Ayala punched her, drawing blood as she broke her nose, and flipped them over, hitting her again. "You know what he did to me. All of them know. He changed who I was supposed to be because of it." She shoved her arm into Aquila's face, the tribal tattoo vibrant and harsh against her skin. "Look at the scars, bitch. Look." The table's legs gave out and they rolled over to the bar, tearing at each other's hair and clothes, blood being drawn by both fighters by fingernails, and in Ayala's case, teeth. Ayala shivered, painfully aware she was exposing a lot of skin she hadn't been at the beginning of the night. She tried to cover herself but received a lone, deep scratch across her wrist for the trouble. Blood began to fly, and Ayala knew that it was only a matter of time before she gave in to the fox, and tore Aquila's pretty head from her shoulders. After he got over his shock and awe, Naruto was the first to react, with Freddy coming right after. While the rest of the bar was cheering, the blonde rushed forward, wrapped his arm around Ayala's waist and yanked her upwards, which, in turn, pulled up Aquila, too. He managed to shove the girls apart long enough for him to put his body between them. He backed up and trapped Ayala in between the bar and his back. He spread his arms out behind him and latched onto the bar counter, effectively creating a cage made out of wood and muscle. However, doing this meant he couldn't defend himself from Aquila, who had renewed her attacks by trying to go through Naruto. She swung and opened up a large gash on her fellow blonde's forehead. Said blonde sighed and braced his foot against her stomach before shoving her back into Freddy's awaiting arms. Freddy wrapped her up in a bear hug that pinned her arms against her sides. She started screaming and shouting obscenities that one would not expect her to know. In mere seconds, Naruto had managed to remove his hoodie and jam it over Ayala's head so that she was covered. But before she could get her arms through the sleeves, he twisted them behind her back and tied them in a knot which effectively created a straitjacket. With the grace of a former ninja, he swept her into his arms bridal style and walked out of the bar. He walked to car and opened the door before gently placing her in the passenger seat. He walked calmly over to his side and got in as well. He looked over to see her struggling madly to get out of the hoodie. Finally she got fed up and screamed, "Let me out of this fucking thing." He smirked, "I will. Once you calm down. Do it now, you blonde bastard." "Are you calm? Hell no. Then I'm not letting you out." She screamed in exasperation before she stopped struggling like a madwoman. He looked over after a minute or so and asked, "Are you calm?" She huffed in annoyance before responding, "Yes. I'm calm. Now will you please undo the sleeves?" Gladly, and without even looking, her reached behind her back and yanked on one of the sleeves, undoing the knot. She pushed her arms through the sleeves, which were too long for her. Naruto cranked the car and looked at her. "I'm not even going to ask what happened back there." Because I'm sure it's something that I don't want to know. So how about I take you to my place? You can have a cup of coffee and then I'll take you to wherever you want. Deal? She hesitated for a second before nodding. He sighed and pulled out of the bar's parking lot. Troublesome women. Somewhere in another world a lazy, spiky-haired slacker sneezed. He kept true to his word, brewing her a cup of coffee in utter silence. She let her eyes roam. The kitchen was an organized, yet somehow less than tidy space, but at least everything was clean. He was never this quiet. She felt like a small child, waiting to be chastised for something she knew she did wrong. He turned over his shoulder to look at her and she curled up in the wooden chair, waiting to be yelled at. He sighed and put her coffee in front of her, then sat across from her, never taking his eyes from her. It made her skin prickle uneasily. She looked behind her quickly, checking for a clock or a painting or anything else he could be staring at, and was greeted with blank wall. She growled, "Quit staring at me." He arched an eyebrow and continued to stare at her. Somehow, that arched eyebrow managed to convey surprise, scorn, a touch of embarrassment, and beneath all that, concern. She quivered and lowered her eyes, pulling the hoodie over her head and handing it back to him, covering herself with one arm. "Can I use your washroom?" He pointed to a door down the hallway, and she hurried there, desperate to wash and assess the damage. She closed the door behind her and sighed at her reflection. She was covered in scratches, the worst ones on her wrist and another bad one on her shoulder. She found a facecloth and, wetting it, began to gently clean the scratches, her eyes examining the tatters of her dress. She frowned, thinking on how to fix it, before finally just turning it backward, the ribbons of the halter becoming black satin that tied beneath her bust. The back of the dress had been hiked up over her bra, resulting in a dangerously short front, but she made it work for what she needed, which was only to be covered. She exited the washroom, only to discover that he had moved to the couch, his cup in his hands, hers on the coffee table. She sat down, moving as far away from him as she could, noticing that his blood had crusted in his hair. She sighed and stared at her now cold coffee. "I want to play a game," he said, his blue eyes focused on her face. "What kind of game?" she replied, with perhaps a tad too much aggression in her voice. "A game of questions. We take turns asking questions and the other person has to answer as honestly as they can. It's like truth or dare, just without the dare part." He smiled at her, and she finally relaxed. "You can go first." The little bit of OCD in her brain was shouting at her about the blood in his hair. She tried to push it down, but the question came blurting out. "Will you let me clean the scratch on your forehead?" He nodded and she scurried back to the bathroom, wetting another face cloth and putting soap on part of it. When she returned, turning his face toward her so she could clean it, his eyes closed as she wiped his blood away with a tender hand. "How can you talk to foxes?" she answered without thinking about it. "They're my representative. I can talk to them because they give off all the characteristics I wanted to exude. Cheekiness, playfulness, loyalty. But that often gets twisted into sly, cunning and dangerous." She bit her lip before she continued, stopping herself. He didn't seem to react, except for a small smile. She licked her lips, and asked another that had been eating at her since she learned his full name. "Okay. Call me stupid, but are you the same Naruto Uzumaki as the one written in the books by Jiraiya Kazumana?" He grinned and got to his feet, leading her to an office space that had papers scattered everywhere. His expression turned sad as he picked up a page. "Jiraiya is a writing name. It's an autobiography. And Namikaze was my father's last name. I use my mother's." She cast her eyes down as he shuffled papers into filing cabinets and straightened the space. His truth meant Nine Tails was in some shape or form real, and he had trained hard in the ways of the shinobi from a young age. She took a step back. He was dangerous. He sighed, "I'm still the same guy, Ayala. I just happen to have a fucked up past and an uncertain future." "You aren't the only one," she whispered. He slowly approached her, leading her back to the couch, his hand carefully placed in hers. She thought of how accustomed she had become to his grip, and how proud she was of herself for not flinching every time he touched her. He asked, his voice guarded, "What can you tell me about your family?" "Family?" She spat the word like it was poison in her mouth. She narrowed her eyes and looked right at him. "Let me tell you what kind of link I have with them. They're just lumps of meat linked by hatred and murderous intent." She forgot who had said it, but it came out of his books. She sighed, and lowered her gaze. She took a deep breath. "What am I to you?" He chuckled. A friend who happens to be a girl, whom I enjoy holding hands with and is a very good kisser. His voice got teasingly husky, moving close enough to her to put his arms loosely around her. One whom I wish would let me get closer. He was teasing. She could tell, but her shoulders tensed anyway. She was winning a battle that told her to move away, and instead, moved closer, trembling as she lay her head on his shoulder. He asked softly, "Why were you all over me when we first met, but trembling now, in my arms?" She pulled away a little. "Because you've trapped me. I don't understand." She got a hold of his shirt and pulled him on top of her as she lay down, putting the pair of them in a very compromising position. She was shaking furiously, but he was shaking too, looking down on her with passion in his eyes. "Ayala, where are your hands?" "At your sides." "Good. Now put them on my wrists." He did, pinning her arms over her head as she closed her eyes to suppress his voice, telling her that he was almost there, she just need to. Her eyes snapped open and she fought his hold on her wrists as she melted, and heard him inhale sharply at the way she vibrated against him. She could hear the growl building deep in his throat. She whimpered, "Naruto, you have complete and total control of my body right now. I no longer am the master of my own fate. You decide whether to tie me up and make me suck on a big one, fuck the brains out of me." He flinched at the vulgar suggestions, etc., or you could let me up. "I don't get to make that choice." "You do." He gently kissed her cheek and helped her sit up, but his eyes betrayed his dirty thoughts. "Ayala." He suddenly found himself unable to speak as she kissed him violently, straddling his lap and grinding her pelvis against his. He gasped, taking her hips in his hands. She pulled away, still grinding. He turned his face away, choking on a small sound. She growled, readjusting her dress so it wouldn't tear in her movements. "Naruto, look at me." He did, and she stopped moving. He whimpered and she felt his muscles in his legs tighten. "Where are your hands?" "Your hips." She started to slowly rock back and forth. She felt his fingers tighten enough to secure her, but not hard enough to stop her. She smirked and leaned down to whisper huskily in his ear, "Who is the mistress of your desires?" "You are. Who has you wrapped around their little finger?" "You." "Ayala." "Dear Cammy." She pulled away, sitting on her side of the couch like nothing happened. She smiled at him. "Understand?" He nodded, squirming uncomfortably. "Go take a cold shower." "I'll wait." He didn't waste any time, practically disappearing into the washroom. She waited patiently for him to return, playing with the dregs of her coffee, making flowers in the bottom of her cup, smiling softly to herself. Flowers were nice. She inhaled deeply, and the scent of soap, men's shampoo and aftershave assaulted her nostrils. Before she could turn to face him, he had started to loosely braid locks of her hair, playing with it softly. She sighed and let him, still shaking. "Can you sit where I can see you?" He sat right next to her, having calmed himself enough with the cold shower. She turned to look at him, and he played with the hair right at the sides of her face, his hands steady and warm. She closed her eyes, trying not to lean away. She opened her eyes. "Do you still think of Hinata?" "All the time." His blue eyes were sad, and he turned away, leaving the braids in her hair to come undone on their own. She combed them out of her hair with her fingers, her eyes cast down in shame. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. It's hurt worse." She stood, picked up his coffee cup and returned to the pot, filling it for him again. She put it back in his hands, and he sighed. "Thank you, Ayala." She nodded in acknowledgement, then sat on the opposite side of the couch, giving him some space. He took a deep shuddering breath and put his head in his hands. Ayala froze, unsure what to do. She recoiled, not wanting to set off the waterworks. It took him a few minutes to gather his composure, and when he turned back to her, his eyes were hard. She was still curled up in a ball, tense. He put his arm on the back of the couch, leaving his side open in a silent invitation. Hesitantly, she moved toward him, not wanting the trap to snap shut on her, leaving her to chew off her leg. Ayala eventually ended up curled against his side, his arms still on the back of the couch. He was staring at a wall, looking troubled, whilst her amber eyes were transfixed by the way his chest rose and fell when he drew in breath. "My next question is tiered." "Tiered? I have to ask a few smaller questions before I get to the big one." "Okay. Do you believe in visions, premonitions, or seeing things while you dream?" She nodded, still watching the way his chest moved. "Yes. Doesn't it make sense? Your brain opens itself up to anything around it and becomes sluggish. It's child's play for something to get into your mind and exploit it. He turned to look at her and rolled closer to her. He sighed and helped her get into a comfortable spot, leaning against him. He tried to touch her as little as possible. Ayala noticed, and he was tense. She had her head on his shoulder, and could feel his voice rumble as he asked his second question. Would you be freaked out if I told you I'd been dreaming of you for nearly a year? Her eyes narrowed. Depends on the dreams. He tilted up her chin so she looked at him, face to face, eyes to eyes. Do you know someone who does or used to go by the name of Artaxias? She jerked her face away, pushing herself as far from him as she could get. She started to shake violently, looking as if she was expecting a blow. No. I don't. He took her hand. Ayala. She shivered, knowing the question that was coming, and dreaded it. Ayala, were you raped as a child? By Artaxias? Why the fuck does it matter? She yanked away, and looked at him, her eyes flashing from amber to yellow to red to ice blue. Tell me, and don't you dare get all sad and coddle me. I don't need it. I don't need anyone. Tell me, Naruto, why in God's name does it fucking matter? He had no answer for her. If he did, it didn't come fast enough. She stormed from his apartment, slamming the door so hard behind her she was sure it woke the neighbors. She headed for the elevator, and when it didn't come for her, she screamed, grabbed the floor button and ripped it out of the wall, snapping cords and electrical wires that sparked fitfully. She threw it to the ground and headed for the stairs, storming down them, the tears starting to come. She came to the bottom of the stairs and stopped, finding a hiding spot beneath the last stairs, in a triangular-shaped alcove where she curled up into a little ball like the broken little coward she was. She knew it too. She knew she was cowardly, taking great heaving breaths as she tried to stop the tears. Her subconscious made a decision for her, turning her into the small white fox with ice-blue eyes. She curled into a ball and covered her nose with her tail, wiping her eyes with her paws. Apparently animals could cry. Naruto sat stunned for a few moments before leaping up and following Ayala out of his apartment. He ran towards the elevator and sighed when he saw the call button destroyed. He rushed down the stairs and looked around frantically for her. When he could find her he growled loudly and a shadow clone poofed into existence. The shadow clone almost instantly shifted form into that of Sasuke. The clone Sasuke was wearing the same infuriating smirk that he had wore when he put his hand through Hinata's chest. Naruto formed a swirling blue ball of chakra in his and drove it into the clone's sternum. The ball grinded and drilled into Sasuke's chest as bits of flesh and droplets of blood turned Naruto's hand red. A sickening squelch was heard as the Rasengan broke through the clone's chest cavity and burst out of its back. The clone slumped forward onto Naruto before dispersing into smoke. Naruto frowned. It wasn't the same as the real thing. The blonde backed away from the stairs and slumped against the cold stone wall of the hallway. He slid down slowly and tilted his head up. He didn't usually cry. He had shed too many tears as it was. But for the first time in a while he felt truly alone. He might have just ruined it with the girl he was started to like. Tears slowly slid down his face. Mom? Dad? What do I do? I feel like an animal that is the last of his species. What do you do when you're the only one? How do I fix it? I want to go home. Naruto slowly rose from his spot on the floor and started walking back up the stairs slowly. Tears still dropped from his face. When he finally got up to his apartment he walked to the storage room and went back to the scroll he got the hoodie out of earlier. He found another set of kanji and put his chakra into the seal. In an instant a lavender jacket with white sleeves was sitting in his lap. Hinata wasn't wearing it when she died. He got up and walked into his bedroom before lying down his bed. He clutched the jacket to his chest and blinked up at the ceiling. I miss you, Haim. Ayala sat shivering in the stairwell, unmoving. She heard his words echo in his ears, and wondered whether or not he had said them to guilt her into setting her feelings aside. A little voice whispered, he would never do that. He knows what pain and isolation feels like. The voice got quieter, and grumbled, probably even more after that little outburst. A louder voice shouted the quiet one down, he hurt her. What kind of questions were those? You can't make that not hurt, no matter how slowly you take it. The quiet voice murmured, he isn't Ares. She likes it when she touches her. He isn't Zeus either. He could be a whole new definition of cruel. Ayala shivered and separated her consciousness from the voices. She turned to face the concrete wall, and turned her thoughts to what he had said. Last of his species, the only one. She rubbed her wrists and cast her eyes down, looking in the dusty corner. Maybe she should go upstairs and make it up to him. She hadn't meant. The loud voice returned, snarling at her. You did too. You wanted him to feel like scum. How dare he make you that uncomfortable? How dare he mention his name? She flinched away, reaching into a concealed pocket and rubbing her fingers against an obsidian rock in the shape of a sickle. Then needed to take her back to her apartment. Soon, before she did something she regretted. Before she did something she knew she had to. She rubbed the sickle harder, telling him to pick her up as soon as he could. She looked up the stairs and held herself back. There had been a spark between the two of them. Between the two shreds of soul left, maybe. Maybe. The quiet voice intruded on her thoughts. Maybe he's the one. Maybe he's that other half mother was always talking about. The loud voice growled. He's dangerous. Ayala looked up the stairs and began to walk up them, then realized that one of her stilettos had snapped. She found the heel on the second-floor landing. She picked up the piece of plastic and spun it in her fingers. She took her shoes off and carried them in her hands, then heard the unmistakable horn of Than's car as he parked in front of the apartment complex. She felt herself torn between fear and concern, unable to decide which one to bend to. The car horn, getting steadily louder and longer, influenced the decision. She huffed back down the stairs and kicked open the front doors, hiking up her dress with one hand, her shoes clutched tightly in the other. She could see him through the tinted windows, just leaning on the horn, sighing with impatience. He rolled his eyes when he saw her and rolled down the passenger side window. Rough night? She tossed her shoes through the window with a resigned sigh. Cut the crap and just take me home. Than's eyes narrowed and he got out of the car, walking around to her side. Did he hurt you? I'll go Grim Reaper on his ass if he touched you, Ayala. I'll kill him. She looked away. Then, please. You don't need to, I promise. Look at me when you make promises, Ayala. It was a command, one she obeyed as she made the promise again. He snarled. You're a terrible liar. She could see his wings rolling beneath his sweater. Don't get your feathers ruffled. Not over me. He rolled his eyes. Stop with the self-pity and get in the car. She put her hand on the car door handle and easily identified the windows to Naruto's apartment. She sighed and heard them start to growl. He knew her weaknesses and wasn't afraid to exploit them. His voice turned angry and commanding, and she felt orange eyes on her, scanning her broken body and soul. Get in the car, bitch. She obeyed. Naruto woke up the next morning to hear someone knocking on his door. He groaned and meandered his way through his home to the door. He opened it groggily and was surprised to see the face of Aquila. You look terrible, Naruto, the blonde woman stated. And he did. His eyes were red and puffy and had bags under his eyes. Naruto was taken aback by the statement but responded sadly, I had a rough night. Aquila sighed and ducked under Naruto's arm and pulled him gently inside. She closed the door and led him to the dining room table before sitting him down. She went to his coffee machine and started brewing a pot. And then she raided his fridge and started cooking some eggs and sausage. Naruto was about to say something, but then he had a weird flashback, and instead of seeing Aquila standing over the stove he saw Tsunade. It made him feel warm inside and he relaxed into his chair. About 15 minutes later Naruto found himself eating quietly across from Aquila, who was doing the same. They sat and ate in silence before Naruto finally gave in to his curiosity. How do you know where I live? Did Freddy tell you? Aquila chuckled and took a sip of her coffee. Naruto, you forget that Frederick's building is less than 5 blocks away. But no, he did not. I just know things. I know a lot of things. Naruto narrowed his eyes and pointed his fork at her. What kind of things? Get your elbow off the table. It's bad manners, Aquila stated. Naruto blushed and removed his elbow from the tabletop but tried to be a smart ass anyway. Yes, Mom. Aquila just took it in stride and said seriously, thank you, dear. Naruto fell silent after that and they finished eating. Aquila gathered the dirty dishes and put them in the dishwasher before gesturing Naruto to join her in his living room. She sat on the love seat and he slouched down on the couch. Naruto looked at her with curiosity. So, why did you stop by today? Aquila's face became concerned. Like a mother, we need to talk. But first I need to ask you a question. Naruto gestured for her to continue. Aquila sighed. If I were to tell you that I was pregnant with Frederick's child, what would you say? Naruto nearly jumped out of his skin. Well, I'd say congratulations. Oh, well, that's go. Naruto cut her off and his face became a mixture between sad and angry. But I would also have to tell you that Freddy isn't ready for a kid. He just isn't. Aquila seems surprised by this information. Why not? He seems responsible. He has a decent job. Naruto made a rumbling sound as his chest. It isn't a matter of responsibility, Aquila. Frederick is perfectly capable of taking care of a child. It's a matter of wanting to. He would feel trapped and held down. He would be resentful. I just don't think he'd make a good dad. At least right now at this stage of his life. Aquila sunk down into her seat. What makes you say that, Naruto? He told me those same words a few months ago when I asked him if he would ever want kids. It was just a random conversation. Aquila seemed troubled by his words before she looked at Naruto with a new fire in her eyes. Look, Naruto. I know you aren't normal. I know that you are skilled and that you are powerful. But I do not know if you are honorable. Naruto tried to say something because he didn't like where this was going, but she didn't give him the chance. If I gave Frederick a child and he did not show a proper desire to care for it, would you take it in and raise it as your own? Naruto started to freak out. That was a loaded question. He spoke frantically. Listen, Aquila, I would, but I don't know if I'm the best choice. I have issues. I'm sure there are plenty of families out there who would adopt. Where would you be anyway? Aquila got up and started pacing. I am not normal, Naruto. You know this. No matter how much I may regret it, I will not be able to stay and care for a child like a proper mother. And no normal person would be able to care for a child of mine. Now answer me, would you or would you not take in our child? Yes, Aquila, but, promise me, Naruto Uzumaki. I promise. No, swear it on the river Styx. Naruto froze. The river Styx? Oh, dear Kami. He was in deep. Aquila snapped her eyes to him when he fell silent, but she looked desperate. Pleading even. He sighed and said the words that he would probably regret later. I swear on the river Styx that, if Freddy should end being a shitty dad, I will take care of your kid. Thunder rumbled in the sky even though there were no clouds. Aquila sighed and sat back down. Thank you. You're welcome. Aquila cut him off with a gray-eyed glare so fierce that it shook him to the bone. But know this, Naruto Uzumaki, former shinobi of Konoha, if you should back out of this promise or fail to uphold it, your life is forfeit. Naruto gulped but then growled, don't question me, Aquila. I never break my promises. I'd rather die first. Aquila smirked, that is good. A fine thing to live by. Naruto nodded and then he became serious. Now, since you obviously know who I am. Who or what exactly are you? I think I deserve to know at this point. Aquila sighed and leaned back to get comfortable. Okay. I suppose that is true. So tell me, Naruto. How much do you know about Greek mythology? Ayala was having a good day. That just meant thousands of other people were not. She sat smiling in the Jewel Gardens, her eyes closed as she encouraged volcanic eruptions that made houses burn and roads melt. Tidal waves turned into rogue ones, flipping boats and getting sunbathers wet. The soft breeze blowing over tropical islands suddenly turned into a hurricane that would ravage the west coast of the United States in a few hours. She frowned, then focused, making it just a lot bigger. Her focus turned to war and she hesitated before laughing. Whatever they were planning was laced with chaos already. She inhaled sharply and got up to take a walk. Everything that happened last night boiled down to Aquila. She was sure of it. She wouldn't have been so ready to explode at Naruto if Aquila hadn't made her erupt in the first place. She found herself wandering from the gardens and out over the sharp gravel toward the edges of the underworld. She wandered the edges of Lake Acheron, staring at Tantalus on his island in the middle. She smiled at him and waved. He raised a hand and resolutely waved back before trying to pick up a bunch of grapes that turned into dust in his hands. She could practically hear his sigh echo across the water. The mouth of a cave loomed out of the gray fog, the stalagmites and stalactites looking for all the world like teeth, extended far back into some terrible creature's throat. Without pause, she descended a series of worn stone steps concealed in the shadows. A large, red door loomed in front of her and she opened it angrily with a cry for her friend. Nemesis. A voice behind her growled, what? You've been smoking again. The blue smoke hung at the ceiling of the dark room and clung to her friend like a second skin. You told me you were going to give it up. Nemesis trailed her fingers over Ayala's shoulders and laughed. It's not like I can get addicted to it. You clearly are. Nemesis rolled her dark eyes and ran her fingers through her short black hair so it stood on end. It adds to the bad girl image. Motorcycle, red leather jacket, thigh-high leather boots, you know. She tapped another out of the little white box they came in and lit up. Blowing the smoke in Ayala's face, she asked with a sneer. Can you make this quick? I've got company. Said company was nowhere to be found. Male company? Nemesis smiled and took a step backward into the smoke-filled room, where a dark figure wrapped an arm around her friend's waist and pulled her close. They stepped forward and Ayala felt her eyes narrow. Nemesis' choice of male company was interesting. His hair was long in the front, and stuck up in the back, dark like anyone else who tended to lean away from the light. His clothing was negligible, what really caught her attention was his eyes. They were red, with a darker circle in the middle of the iris, on which 3 young symbols were suspended. She recoiled with a snarl. And where are you from? His eyes darted to her, fixing her in a red gaze. Around, that's all you need to know. Ayala bared her teeth. Thanks to those dumb she now thanked him for writing books Naruto had written. She could recognize those eyes from a mile away. Is it really? It was his turn to frown at her as she turned to Nemesis. What's he doing here? She smiled. Aris, this is. I know who he is. Why is he here? Nemesis frowned, to repay a debt. Ayala frowned. I'll be leaving you two to that then. She turned to walk away. Nemesis snarled. I'll do what you want because you whooped Athena's ass last night. It was enjoying to watch. Ayala nodded her thanks. Nemesis continued. The answers you're looking for lie with a girl named Hinata. She's in Elysium. Her male companion stiffened slightly at the name and Ayala was glad for it. Rotten two-faced son of a bitch. Make sure to send your companion back to where he came from, Nemesis. There is no place for him on Demeter's green earth. Or under it, for that matter. Ayala walked away, pretending she hadn't absorbed that bit of information as she hurried up the stairs, feeling Sharingan red burn into the small of her back. She found herself knocking on a door with brass numbers, her hands folded behind her back. She held herself tall and proud, trying to mask her fear. Coming across as a thief or... The door opened, answered by a beautiful woman with dark hair and pale violet eyes. Ayala jumped when she realized they had no pupils. The woman smiled, wearing the clothes assigned to Elysium, a white shirt and dark-colored pants or jeans. Hinata, my name is. Come in, please. She pointed with her thumb over her shoulder. I have lemonade if you like. No thank you. Ayala entered, carefully placing her shoes by the door. Hinata poured 2 glasses of lemonade and set them on a low table, where she sat cross-legged. She smiled as Ayala copied her, trying to be polite. Hinata said softly, I know why you're here, Ayala. Ayala chuckled softly. A lot of people have told me that today. You're trying really hard to understand, aren't you? I don't want to come across as trying to steal him. He should always remember you. And what you did for him. Hinata took a long drink of lemonade, looking thoughtful. Her eyes fixed on Ayala and scanned her. All I ever wanted was for him to be happy. If you can do that, then you can. I'm trying. She shook her head. Not hard enough. Ayala frowned. I beg your pardon? Hinata rolled her eyes. Put your attitude away and just listen. It's evident in the way you sit you have problems. Ayala stiffened and started to protest, her eyes flashing. Hinata sighed and put her head in her hand. There is your problem. Where? Hinata pushed the lemonade into her hands. You can't listen. If you can't listen, then you can't understand what he's trying so hard to tell you. Ayala was silent now. Hinata smiled. I'm dangling a carrot in front of your nose. I can tell that makes you angry. But I can also tell that you're angry because of what happened to you. Her eyes narrowed. But this isn't about you. This is about him. He likes you, or at least he did. But you can't put aside your own self-pity to care for someone who has been through a lot more shit than you. Ayala snarled. You can't talk to me that way. Hinata said calmly. I can, and I will. You came here for my help. I'm helping you. Ayala was quiet again. Hinata spoke, as a ninja. You have to be able to see underneath what's underneath. We know what he is on the outside. He's a bit of a smart ass who can kick major butt when he wants to. But what's beneath that? Kurama. Ayala said without hesitation. You're being too literal. Ayala thought carefully. He's lonely. Hinata nodded. And beneath that? You don't know, do you? Ayala shook her head, looking away. He's scared. He's just a scared little boy who never knew his family and has had nearly everything taken from him. But you can't see that, can you? You can only see you, and are too immersed in trying to help yourself than to make a difference. He deserves you, but you don't deserve him. He would give you the world on a silver platter if you wanted it. What could you give him? What does he like? What does he want out of life? Listen to him, and put away your past. Lock it up and put it on a high shelf, don't wear it like armor. Because underneath all those layers of chaos and strife and hatred, you're scared too. Ayala got up and looked away, tears in her eyes. Hinata opened the door for her, and closed it behind her when she left. Ayala disappeared in a puff of silver smoke, tears in her eyes. She had work to do, listening, understanding, and trying. She had to try harder. Naruto was amazed. No, he was fascinated. So you're Athena, huh? Achilles smiled and nodded. Naruto grinned and before chuckling, why is that I suddenly feel very stupid? Aquila laughed, you aren't stupid. I just have more knowledge than you. Now, Naruto, I would suggest getting a book about babies. Just in case. Right after she said that, one of Naruto's clones walked through the door with his face stuck in a book and bag in his hand. He sat down on the other side of the couch. Aquila's eyes widened, that technique is extremely useful. The possibilities it could open up. Naruto smirked and took a bite of the burger his clone brought him. Yeah, I know. It's totally awesome. Naruto's clone raised an eyebrow. This book is about regular babies. Is there anything we should know about demigod babies? Aquila started to inspect the clone when he asked the question. Wow. And they are completely independent and can think for themselves? That's amazing, and should be impossible. The real Naruto sighed in exasperation. Aquila. Focus, said blonde woman, blushed and sat down between the two Narutos so she could still study the clone. Ah yes. Well, they often have ADHD and dyslexia. This is mostly because of their Greek blood. Their brains are hardwired for ancient Greek, not anything else. So they might have trouble reading at first. And they won't be able to stay still for long. But a child of mine should have an easier job with that. Naruto nodded and stored that away. Anything else? Aquila nodded. This is where your shinobi skills come in handy. Those monsters that were in the myths are real. Just like us. And they really don't like demigods. So you will run into them and you will have to kill them. So that's why I've replaced your kunai and shuriken with celestial bronze kunai and shuriken. Naruto nodded, but then he jumped up and went into his storage room before he came back out with Asuma's trench knives. You see these? These are made of a chakra conductive metal. It lets me channel my chakra through them and do cool stuff. I probably won't be able to do the same things with celestial bronze. Do you think you could help me out? Naruto asked while holding the blades out to his godly friend. Aquila took the blades and inspected them before smirking. I think I know someone who could help out. Now I must go. Here, take this. If I need to talk to you, you'll hear it. She handed him a necklace with an owl pendant. He nodded and pulled it over his head. She smiled one last time before disappearing through his front door. Naruto sighed and looked at his clone. Keep reading. I need to get back in shape. With that he disappeared in a flash of orange light. He was going to the redwood forest. Ayala knocked on the apartment door, having climbed the flight of stairs she couldn't last night. Naruto? She knocked again, a little louder, and waited. When no one replied, she tried the doorknob, and found it unlocked. A great sense of unease washed over her, and she stepped into the apartment, hearing the storm rolling in from the west, still a while away. Something was off. The scent of coffee and paper was predominant, but there was something off about the place. The spare room door was open, and she walked over to it, her eyes curious and shifting. Laying on the floor in meticulously neat rows was dozens of sharp things she recognized as shuriken and kunai, as well as others that were oddly shaped, jagged blades, twisted into impossible shapes. She frowned, looking at a lighter space on the carpet where something had been for a while. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the impressions in the carpet, frowning. Trench knives. She flipped on the light switch and was dazzled by the amount of celestial bronze in the room, watching the light dance off the angles of the knives and variety of stars. She recoiled from them, and turned the light off again. She returned to the living room and smelt the remains of a late breakfast, coffee and eggs and sausage. A book was out of place on the table and her suspicions rose again. It was a dual book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and The Early Years. Baby books. Why in the hell did he have baby books? She let herself become the little white fox, and padded softly around the apartment, finding a peculiar scent on the love seat and in the spare room. It smelled young. She inhaled again, and what she got as the fox right away was baby bird or young mouse. But the scent on top of that was the smell of a musty old library, the smell she associated with knowledge, with wisdom. Athena. Aquila. Her fox's nose continued to sniff, discovering what had happened. Athena felt fear. Naruto was angry and apprehensive, and then was scared. She had threatened him, making him swear on the sticks. Freddy wasn't ready, but Athena thought Naruto was. For a child? She couldn't say if he was, yet something else she didn't know about him. Her eyes turned sad, then angry. Athena was pregnant with a thought child she couldn't guarantee parents for? Sounds like another Olympian she knew. Her head started to rain, blood pounding furiously behind her eyes, in her temples. It was a summons from Olympus, and her father's voice echoed from his platinum throne, all the way across the country. All gods, large and small, are to report to Olympus. She wailed, and toppled, straight into the rows of weaponry, scratching herself in 1,000 places. She thrashed as her true godly form was forced on her, her hand wrapping around the blade of a kunai, cutting deep into her skin. There was a noise like a gunshot and a flash of white light, and all that betrayed her presence had ever been in the apartment was a small burn mark in the carpet and the shuriken scattered everywhere, glittering gold on burnished bronze. Arise and be accounted, Eris, daughter of Hera. Her tail swished impatiently as she stood, ears pointed flat back against her skull as she stood, robed in a chiton of black and silver. She did not bow, but she never did. The council grumbled, gathered in a loose circle of multicolored thrones. She sat at the throne of her uncle's throne, a visitor throne of thundercloud, curled up against her consort. When she had first returned to a council, she returned holding the hand of her fellow ward of the underworld, Thanatos. She was the only one, it seemed, who was not afraid to touch him. His true form was a cowled figure with bony hands and no eyes. She wasn't showing her affection, she was leading him along, but the accepted opinion was that they were together. Zeus stood, his hands raised for silence, a presence that pressed heavily on her mind. Her nephew's hand tightened in her own, her other hand curled around the bronze kunai hidden by her chiton. She growled, as her father began to speak. Brothers, sisters, son and daughters, nieces and nephews, my immediate family has an announcement to make. Eris snarled with distaste, another demigod? Great news. Thanatos growled in her ear. Not now. Zeus narrowed his eyes at his youngest daughter but continued. My daughter, Athena has provided this family with a great blessing. She has found a mortal worthy enough to bring me another grandchild. Scattered applause burst through the hall, mostly from the major gods, standing at over 25 feet tall, but not from Eris, or some of the other minor gods. They stood at about 15 feet tall. Athena stood gingerly and walked to her father's side, taking his arm. She smiled prettily. The applause died away, but Eris began, everything clicking into place for her. She started laughing, gathering her skirts so she could stand. Thanatos let out a small whimper as he became blind, and sat very still. She smiled up at Athena. Are you afraid, sister? Afraid the father will cast you away? Afraid you'll need a surrogate? She wrinkled her nose in distaste. I have no need to fear a broken minor goddess who can't control her temper. Thunder rumbled, and not by Zeus' doing. Eris smiled, and bronze glittered in her palm. Be afraid, sister, be very afraid. The kunai buried itself blade first into Athena's shoulder, snapping off at the hilt as it grew to god-threatening proportions. She couldn't catch it in time and she tumbled from the force of the blow. Black smoke began to billow around Eris in a tightening spiral that began at her feet. I curse you, Athena, Hera's daughter. For knowing of what our brother did to me and not acting on it. I curse you and the child in your belly. May the father never accept her. May she never know maternal or paternal love, as I have. May she be resentful of you to the end of her days. Her palm was extended, a glowing ball of many colors pulsing between her fingers, and Zeus turned frantically to Nemesis, who shrugged. My deal was cut. The die is cast. Her fate is sealed. The ball flew from Aella's fingers and struck Athena in the chest, knocking the woman flat on her back. Zeus roared, seize her. Ares stood, snarling with menace in his eyes, hunger suppressed beneath that. Gladly, sir. He approached her and she stood tall and strong, trying not to shake. She was not scared. She was not scared. The smoke swirled faster around her ankles, reaching her knees. She was not scared. Don't touch her. Thanatos had stood, his raven wings spread for balance. He found her hand and rapidly squeezed it several times. He was telling her to go. She squeezed once, long and hard. Yes. He spread his wings in a challenge, his bony hand balled into fists. Ares snorted and drew a blade from one of the many at his belt. By the time the god of war worked up enough nerve to attack the god of death, Eris was gone. Zeus roared, "Find her!" He jumped high into a tree the second she touched his arm. He had a blade in his hand and she screamed, "Power down and listen to me. We need to get out of here." He snarled, "What do you mean?" "I mean that unless you've got 500,000 of those celestial bronze Shruariken on you. My brother about to descend from Mount Olympus and do some serious damage." His eyes turned hard and darted to a clearing he could see through the trees, where something strange began to shine and dance. There was the clink of bronze on bronze and Aella turned frantic, her hands clutching at her clothes, scared. She was scared. Dear gods, she was so scared. The blonde went to jump down to meet the man who was making all the noise and he felt some latch onto his arm. He turned to look at Aella and saw the fear in her eyes. He sighed and pried her hand off. He jumped down and started walking towards the man who had now entered his field of vision. He was a hulking man that was taller than Naruto, who stood at 6 feet 3 inches, and he was bound in muscle. This was a fact that made Naruto smirk. He might be strong, but Naruto was strong and fast. The man carried a spear and a bronze Spartan shield. Naruto sighed in disappointment. Naruto waited until the man was about 10 yards in front of him before he spoke. "What brings someone like you down to my neck of the woods? You aren't lost, are you? Where is she?" Naruto chuckled, straight to point, I like that. He started to gather Kurama's chakra inside of himself. Man, this guy was getting a beat down. Ares snarled, "Yes. Now I ask again, mortal. Where is she? Do not make me kill you." Ares was surprised when the blonde insect in front of him started to giggle. He was even more surprised when those giggles turned into full-blown laughter. This made his blood boil. "Silence, mortal. What is so funny?" Naruto's laughter died down and his face hardened. "What's funny? The fact that you think you can kill me. I may be mortal, but I have something you don't. An inner demon." After he spoke those words, power exploded out from him in a shockwave that made Ares stumble backwards. His body became engulfed in a shroud of flaming yellow chakra. A trench coat appeared on his form and strange black markings spread all over his body and clothes. Naruto blurred from sight and Ares froze in surprise. That hesitation lost him the entire fight. The blonde reappeared in front of the god with his leg extended in a side kick that crumpled Ares' breastplate and sent him crashing through an entire redwood. Again the blonde blurred from existence before appearing behind the war god's flying form. He lashed out with another sidekick that caught the man in the back, which created a sickening crunch and a gasp of pain. Ares found himself hurtling through the air again, except this time he was traveling in the direction he came from. Naruto laughed madly before teleporting in front of the god and snapping his leg straight up into his chin, launching Ares into the air and shattering his jaw. He quickly joined his enemy in the air wearing a demented grin on his face. He clasped his hands together and brought them down on the war god's cranium. This action redirected Ares' path of motion straight towards the ground, where he landed with a crash on his stomach. While he was still in the air, Naruto made a clone that launched the original towards the ground in a blur. A split second before impact, Naruto flipped and slammed down onto the god's back feet first. The collision sent up a plume of dust and dirt. When the dust cleared, Naruto stood at the rim of a decent-sized crater which at bottom lay Ares, broken and defeated. Naruto sniffed in disdain. "What a?" Aella couldn't decide whether to be impressed, terrified or confused. Ares was down. Naruto, staring at her brother, crumpled and beat up at the bottom of a crater. She called from the edge of the clearing, "There'll be more, and he could respawn at any time." She walked up to edge of the crater, trembling at the orange eyes that were blank with unconsciousness. "We need to get you out of here." He looked at her with an eyebrow raised. "I can take them. Maybe the first time. Maybe if you got lucky." She snarled him down. "If they happened to go godly on you, you'd be incinerated until not even ashes remained. And then Kurama would be my problem, free to roam as he pleases, killing millions of people on a whim." He snarled at her, "I've taken down armies more powerful than this little." She grabbed him by the collar and pulled him down to eye level, thrusting her hand into his face. A teeny tiny spark glowing in her palm, brighter and hotter than any beach in California. He shut his eyes and turned his face away from the heat as his skin began to turn red. He had a hand on her wrist, trying to push her away, but she moved closer to him with every word. Don't get cocky. She moved without effort, against him and all the chakra he was willing to use on her, until the little ball of light was nearly up his nose. She closed her hand and growled, "Naruto Uzumaki, welcome to the big leagues. You don't understand the rules of the game and you're still trying to play. This isn't Street Fighter or Super Mario. You only get one life, as you may as well use it to do something right." He snarled and she growled him down, eyes turning ice blue, her pupils becoming slitted. "Come on, I'm your cheat code." She smiled cheekily, listening to the storm she had created that morning begin to rip through the coastline. "Use me to your advantage." Naruto sighed and the chakra shroud disappeared from around him. His face became one that a person in thought would use. Finally, he spoke and it was in a serious voice. "You need to go back to wherever you stay for the time being. I'll go back to my apartment. Meet me there when you think it's safe." Ayala's eyes became worried. "No. You need to come with me. We'd be safer together. They'd find you in Heartbeat and you won't be as lucky when they do." Naruto laughed. "I'll be fine. My apartment is plenty safe for me. Trust me, I have insurance. They can't touch me, not unless I directly challenge them." Ayala growled, "What makes you so sure?" He was being cocky again. Naruto scratched at his shirt where Athena's pendant was tucked under his shirt. "Just trust me. I'll be fine." He disappeared in an orange flash and then reappeared moments later with an odd tri-pronged kunai in his hand. He held it out to her. "Here. Take this. If you need me, just throw it into the ground near you and I'll be there in a flash." Ayala took it skeptically. "I don't think it will work where I'm going." Naruto chuckled. "Trust me. It will. I see you later." He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek before disappearing back to his apartment. Ayala blushed and disappeared in a mist. Naruto sighed tiredly and down cross-legged on his bed. He had just taken a shower and he was tired. His hands folded in his lap and he closed his eyes. Almost in an instant he was transported into his mindscape. He walked through the bars of the gate and up to his friend. He sighed and tapped on the nose of the giant fox. "It's time to wake up, buddy." Kurama's red eyes opened slowly before they focused on Naruto. His maw opened wide and he yawned loudly. "Why do you wake me, Naruto? Who is it that we must fight? Sasuke is dead, isn't he?" Naruto nodded and jumped onto his friend's snout and crouched down so he could look him in the eyes. "Yes, but a lot has happened since then." And he went into the long, weird story of how he got into this new world and what had happened since he had. They were talking for countless hours. Finally, Naruto fell silently and Kurama finally spoke. "That is a lot to take in, Naruto, but I agree with your deal with the wisdom goddess. Very honorable, if a little foolish." Naruto nodded but then frowned. "But we aren't biggest kids in the schoolyard anymore, Kurama. At least not as we are now. We need to start working together again. No more sleeping." Kurama huffed. "Yes, that is very true. But do not count us out. They have never dealt with us before. They obviously don't know what they are dealing with if your fight with that bastard war god is anything to go by. I wonder if they can even be killed." Naruto laughed. "I made Ares bleed. If he can bleed then he can die. I hope it doesn't come to that though." Kurama chuckled. Naruto sighed and stood up. "Well, I've rested for long enough. It should be morning if not noon by now. I'll loosen the seal." Kurama nodded and stretched. This was going to be interesting. Naruto faded from his mindscape and opened his eyes in the real world. He stood up and lifted his shirt to expose the seal. The finger on his right hand glowed with blue chakra and he pressed them into the seal on his stomach before twisting it loose a decent amount. He sighed and felt his chakra and Kurama's meld together. It was a pleasant feeling even if it was a little weird. He sighed and walked into the living room before sitting on the couch. He picked up the baby book and continued from where his clone left off. "You still don't know the rules of the game, do ya, kid?" Hades smirked, watching the kid jump, throwing the baby book down on the table and pulling something sharp out of his pocket. "Who are you? How'd you get in here?" "Name is Hades, Lord of the Dead." "Hi, how you doing?" The blonde looked confused. "You're the man that took Ayala in. You're her surrogate." He frowned, green eyes flashing. "Well, I hate to tell you this, Buko. But you see, my priorities have shifted recently, and instead of having a beautiful daughter, I got these. He locked eyes with the blonde, unafraid. Between his fingers ran a river of tiny cut gems that glittered in the sunlight, sapphires, rubies, diamonds and emeralds. The blonde growled, "You traded her for jewelry? Not just jewelry. A wonderful little toy that makes a certain idiotic shinobi appear wherever I need him to." He threw the three-pronged kunai into the floor and wound up. Naruto disappeared, then opened up into an uppercut he was not prepared for. This happened twice more until the ninja got a hold of the dark man's arm and twisted it behind his back in a powerful hold. Hades sighed, "And she thought you were big league material." There was a shock wave that Naruto didn't just see and feel, but tasted as he slammed through the wall, drywall crumbling into his hair. He coughed, the taste of iron heavy on his tongue. A voice from his past called through the dust, grumbling, "Stay out of my way. Loser." At the mention of loser, there were 1,000 voices pressing on his mind, echoing the word and choice others, laughing at him. Naruto looked around at the bronze weaponry, selecting a katana and smoothly sliding it from its wooden sheath, a snarl on his face. Loser. Freak. Loser. The laughter, the constant laughter. He launched through the dust, howling a challenge and found a whole lot of nothing. No voices, no creepy dark man, nothing. He frowned and turned to the balcony, pulling open the curtains. "Miss me?" Hades growled as his hiding place was revealed. He didn't flinch as the katana swung at his head, and watched as the weapon passed right through him, several times, much to the confusion of the blonde. He laughed. "Hard to kill when we're immortal. Ain't we?" Hades seized the blonde by the front of the jacket and pulled him close. "This apartment is heavily guarded. She cannot come to you here. Go to her instead." His eyes turned kind. "Listen now and listen well. She's fine, but the rules only get more complicated. You'll last longer with a teammate at your side." He pressed the three-pronged kunai into Naruto's hands. "Not hundreds of miles below ground. Are you my ally?" Hades chuckled. "The way she talks about you, I'd like to think so." The dark man dropped his voice. "Go to her apartment. You'll be safer there, for now." He vanished into a shadow of smoke that sunk into the ground. Ayala pestered him with questions. "Does he get it? Did you hurt him?" Hades rolled his eyes, sipping nectar from a tall glass. "I can never be sure, Ayala. I can never be sure." Naruto sighed and started to pack clothes and sharp things into a large duffel bag. The last thing he put in was Hinata's jacket. He smiled and held it to his nose for a moment before placing it in the bag. He slung the bag over his shoulders and walked into the living room. He picked up the baby book people kept keeping him from reading. He grabbed his car keys and walked out of his apartment. About 20 minutes later, Naruto was staring at the door to Ayala's apartment. He debated whether or not he should knock. He could just pick the lock, but wanted to know if she was at the apartment or not, so he stood perfectly still so he could gather natural chakra. While he was doing this, he was reaching out to see whether there was anything alive in the apartment. There wasn't, so he picked the lock and walked in. He didn't even begin to look around the apartment. Instead, he just found her living room and sat on the couch. Just as he was about to start reading again, he heard a voice in his head. A voice that wasn't Kurama's. "Naruto, are you alive? If you think your response back to me." "Aquila? Oh, good. Where are you right now?" Naruto smirked. She sounded worried. "I'm at Ayala's apartment." Aquila grumbled with distaste inside his mind. "I still don't know what you see in that woman. But that is beside the point. Thanks to Ayala, you are most likely going to be receiving a daughter soon." Naruto's eyes widened. He had been hoping that Freddy would see the light. What had Ayala done to assure that he didn't? "What happened?" he asked in a quiet tone. Aquila then retold the events that took place at the meeting. Naruto sighed. He felt that he was ready. As long those pesky gods left him alone. Monsters he could handle. Gods? Not yet. "Will you tell me when she appears? Or if Freddy rejects her?" Naruto asked suddenly. "Yes." And with that said, Aquila fell silent. Naruto rubbed his temples and groaned. But then his eyes lit up and he started reading with renewed enthusiasm. As the day turned dark and the city began to die, Ayala put her book down and began to collect things for her visitor's bed. She threw pillows and sheets into an ever-growing pile in the hall as she pawed through the closet in her bedroom. He was so absorbed in learning about babies, He didn't notice until she pulled the lever on the back of the futon that suddenly had him sprawled on his back, frowning up at her. "Can I help you?" She jacked her thumb over her shoulder to the bathroom. "Your bag is in there. Go have a shower. I'll make your bed. I'm busy. I'm learning stuff. You are also stinking up my apartment." She snatched the book from him. "Go on. If you need anything, holler for me." She left his book on the coffee table. She picked up a sheet and began to unfold it, snapping it several times to get the creases out of it. "Ayala." He was standing right behind her, and she jumped. "What?" He smiled. "Can I have my book?" She picked the book off the table, and walked up to him, smiling back. She presented it with both hands. He reached out to take it and she frowned, and started to batter him madly over the head and shoulders with it. He bolted into the bathroom and locked the door. She pounded on it furiously, then shouted through it, "I win." She thought she heard a chuckle come through the door, but wasn't sure, and she left the book by the door as she went back to making his bed. When finished plumping the pillows and tucking the dark blue comforter into place, she pressed her ear against the door of the bathroom, listening for the sounds of running water. She heard them, and ducked quickly into her bedroom to retrieve a long black box from beneath her bed. She pulled the lid off and smiled at what greeted her, a black blade with silver grips, which she removed gently from the box. She carried it blade down into her living room, and clearing space by moving the coffee table out of the way, took up a defensive stance, with her body crouched low, blade protecting her chest and neck. She sighed, clearing her mind. She sprang forward, pivoting on her right foot and flinging the blade down with both hands in a sharp exhalation. She inhaled again, and the blade swung through the air, singing with speed until she arched it in a sea that was meant to get beneath armor and tear it away. Then pulling a dagger from her pocket, she brought both blades down together, smashing her opponent in the head, before kicking him over. She then growled, facing another with a mace. He swung it in both hands, coming at her with bloodlust in his eyes. He swung for her head and she bent backward, springing onto her hands as she kicked him in the chin, sending him reeling. She landed on her feet and stepped forward, the tip of her blade tearing him open from navel to chest. She imagined his guts spilling out of his abdomen. It made her smile, then when his mace dropped and he curled up in pain, presenting the back of his neck like a criminal on the executioner's block. She took the opportunity to sever his head from his shoulders, smiling as his make-believe blood spattered her face. She kept going, defeating a spearman by knocking the spear aside, pivoting inwards on her left foot and driving the blade up into his heart. She was about to finish her routine when a bronze blade came singing through the air in her peripheral vision. She parried, sparks flying, and dodged away. She ended up crouched on the coffee table, staring at Naruto, who wore nothing but a towel, a katana clutched in his hands. He grinned, pretty impressive for a girl. She felt her nose wrinkle as she bared her teeth. "You get points for first blood and for winning. You also get points for blocking a blade and attacking instead of dodging." She hefted her blade in both hands, smirking. "If I win, you owe me a cup of coffee. If you win," he smiled, "I get a favor from you." "Deal." They shook on it and retreated to opposite sides of the room, where both took up defensive stances. She cleared her throat and took a deep breath. They eyed each other for a long time, assessing one another. Then Naruto snarled, taking matters into his own hands, and charged her. She smiled, remaining perfectly still until he was nearly upon her, before thrusting her blade forward suddenly, causing him to stop, otherwise risk getting impaled. She batted the katana aside when he attacked and spun inward on herself, blade held close. When he lunged forward again, swinging with both hands, she shoved him aside, and her blade nicked him from his left armpit to the middle of his back. He snarled at the burning sensation, and he suddenly got fast. Not arrow fast, but bullet fast, resulting in nearly 5 minutes of her dodging around him in a frantic dance until she didn't bend backward quite fast enough to avoid his blade coming at her right hip, where it scratched her lightly, blood beading on her skin. She did some mental math and frowned. He was winning. He grinned down on her and continued to attack her, and she managed to draw blood on his chest, with a diagonal cut that started at his collarbone. Both of them had started to sweat, and he snarled, "I just took a shower. Get over yourself, pretty boy." She slashed violently and he recoiled, stumbling on the rug. She drove him backward until his knees hit the table, and she abandoned her sword, and tackled him, flipping him over. When they landed, she was quick to put all of her weight in the small of his back and took his wrist in hand, beating it against the floor until he released the katana, which she tossed over her shoulder and heard it stick in the wood of the floor. She grabbed a handful of his hair and wrenched back, pressing her dagger to his throat. He grumbled something and she whispered in his ear, "I didn't catch that, sweetie. You win. I'll buy you coffee." She shook her head. He flinched as her breath tickled his ear. "You have more points for all the dodging you made me do. You win." She kissed the space just beneath his earlobe, on his neck, and he shivered. She got up carefully, then helped him up. When both of them had settled into bed, weapons tucked away, wounds cleaned, and reading, a storm came in from the Pacific. Ayala just tuned it out and fell asleep, curled up in layers of satin and fine pillows. She did not dream, thankfully. A loud clap of thunder startled her from sleep around 1:30. She rolled over, frowning upon the fact she had been disturbed, and saw something strange. There was light seeping through the bottom of her door. She got up and walked out to where Naruto was sleeping. She sighed and saw the blankets shift. He was probably asleep. She flinched as another loud peal of thunder rolled from the clouds. The blankets shifted again. She turned out the light and he screamed, "Turn it back on. Turn it on." She did, confused. When the light came up, she saw him sitting bolt upright, clutching at a light lavender sweater, his eyes red. He was shaking with fear as he buried his face in the fabric, trembling. He pulled the blankets over his head and started to rock back and forth, crying. She walked toward him, and when she sat beside him and put her hand on his shoulder, he grabbed her wrist, and looked at her with the eyes of a trapped animal, frantic, alone, and terrified. Naruto kept looking at her with those eyes until he winced and held his head. Ayala looked at him with concern. "You okay?" He smiled and the look faded from his eyes. "Yeah. The fox snapped me out of it." Still, the name-calling wasn't necessary. Ayala frowned. What was that about? Naruto sighed and rubbed his shoulder. "The dark gives me flashbacks sometimes. Those days that I wrote about were pretty terrifying even if I wouldn't admit it to myself. War isn't pretty, something I'm sure you know already." Ayala just nodded before smiling. "Let's play the question game again. We never finished. And I do believe it's my turn." Naruto just grinned and gestured for her to ask her question. Okay, so you seem pretty interested in reading about babies. Would you be ready for a kid?" Naruto scratched his chin but nodded. "Yep. I've always wanted a family of my own. Comrades and friends are close but it's not the same. I know it would be hard at first but I believe I would be a good dad." Ayala smiled. He was so happy when he was talking about it. Naruto looked at her. "So, what about you? Would you ever have kids?" He needed to know this answer. Ayala seemed startled by the question. "I don't know. I'm pretty messed up. I don't really think I'd make a good mom. I'd be too overprotective." Naruto smirked at her and laid back down on the futon. Ayala followed his movement and snuggled into his side. He looked down at her and grinned. "Being overprotective wouldn't make you a bad mom. It just means you care." Ayala shrugged in response. Ayala looked up at him. "What exactly did you promise to Akila?" "I saw the pendant and I know what it means." Naruto raised his eyebrow in slight surprise. "You saw that, huh?" "Well, I promised that I would take care of her and Freddy's kid if he didn't feel inclined to." Ayala huffed. "I guess I kinda made that a certain thing, didn't I? Damn, she had basically helped Athena out with that curse. Her kid would get a better father anyway." Naruto chuckled. "I don't know whether to thank you or scold you for doing something so utterly insensitive." Ayala grumbled. "Insensitive? How?" Naruto flicked her in the ear, which got a surprised yelp out of her. "Because you almost forced a horrible thing on an innocent child. I don't care how much you don't like Athena, going that low over a vendetta is never okay." Ayala thought about it and lowered her eyes in shame. He was right. "I suppose that was kinda harsh of me. I should apologize." Naruto laughed. "You make an apology? That doesn't seem likely." Ayala smirked. "Yeah, you're right. I'll think of something. Maybe I'll get her nice owl-down pillow. As a peace offering." Naruto chuckled before closing his eyes. Her silence lulled him to sleep. Ayala thought of another question. "If I told you that I could talk to Hinata, what would you say?" She frowned when he didn't say anything. "Naruto?" She looked up and saw him sleeping peacefully. She smiled. It was probably for the best that he hadn't heard her. Just as she wasn't about to go back to her own bed, Naruto's arm wrapped around her waist and pulled her closer to him. She panicked at first but then realized that he wasn't holding her there. He had just moved her. She bit her lower lip and debated in her mind before finally she hesitantly laid her head down on his chest and snuggled down. She sighed in contentment and let his heartbeat send her back to sleep. Ayala blinked awake on a particular day she hated. She closed her eyes and willed the world to go back to sleep and forget this day altogether. When the pink and red hearts flew in the wind like leaves. When everyone either felt massive amounts of love or felt like the crying potato. She sighed and buried her face in her pillow, feeling a little resistance from Naruto's arm wrapped around her waist. He grumbled and pulled her back to him, his body spooned gently around hers. She sighed and closed her eyes with a soft smile. It had been a few months since their incident with the thunder and the dark, but having him beside her felt. He murmured her name softly and grinned. Ayala. He made tiny motions like he was shaking his head. Ayala. She grinned and closed her eyes. It felt right. He inhaled sharply, and she knew he was waking up. He let go of her to stretch, then returned, kissing her cheek and shaking her shoulder gently. Ayala. Ayala, time to get up. She didn't respond, wondering what he would do next in an attempt to wake her. He gently ran his fingers along her spine several times, pausing once to gently push her sweats down about half an inch so he could trace the shape of the tattoo just where a bundle of nerve endings were close to the skin. He did this several times, raising goosebumps on her skin until she started to tremble. He then let her roll onto her back and he saw her eyes, which were genuinely weirded out. He laughed at her, and she frowned at him. That wasn't funny. He stifled his laughter long enough to speak. You're the color of a beet, Ayala. At that, she felt the heat of the blood rushing through her face. Shut up, come on. He frowned. You forgot, didn't you? Forgot what? Alpine meadows? She paled. Holy Hera, I forgot. This spawned another round of laughter from him as she turned frantic, hunting through the apartment for her skiing equipment. While she got a bag together, he made a light breakfast, coffee once again letting its scent drift through her apartment. She threw her stuff by the door, a duffel bag and a suitcase, along with her equipment. He was sitting at the kitchen table finishing what was probably his third or fourth cup. She picked up a magazine, rolled it tightly and thwacked him on the head, making him sputter. Thanks for the help. He coughed, smiling. You're welcome. Once they managed to cram all they needed for a weekend in the mountains into his car, they were off, the road winding before them. Radio cranked up and windows rolled down. After about 15 quiet minutes on the interstate, he offered her his hand. She smiled and took it, fingers lacing. They stumbled into a log cabin far from the main road, clutching at each other and shivering. Both of their suits were covered in snow and they were soaked to the bone, having been on the hills for nearly 6 hours without a break. They looked at each other and laughed. Dibs on the tub. Ayala smirked, knowing about the huge soaker tub in the washroom. Naruto frowned. Fine, but there was a cheeky sparkle in his eyes that Ayala didn't like. She stripped down to her long johns and hung everything else by the fire, which Naruto lit with ease. She bolted into the bathroom and immediately turned on the hot water, filling the room with clouds of steam. Sighing with delight, she unwrapped the complimentary bar of soap, which smelt of green tea and honey. She sighed and found candles along the edge of the tub, which she lit with excitement as she adjusted the tap water to the perfect temperature. The clouds of steam made her feel like the bathroom was floating as she stepped over the edge of the soaker and sat in the deep water, feeling the blood return to her extremities, and the candles started to give off more of the green tea scent. The lights in the bathroom suddenly went out. The door opened, then closed. There was the sound of cloth sliding over skin and she froze, a bunch of shampoo in her hand. There was a soft splash and Naruto whispered, "I'm cold too." She sat very, very still as the shampoo leaked through her fingers. His hand gently found hers beneath the water and asked softly, "May I?" She nodded, and he picked up the shampoo in one hand and started to massage it into her scalp, tilting her chin up to keep it out of her eyes. She whimpered, leaning back into his shoulder, amazed at how good it felt. He was so gentle, but so sure in his movements, his breath slow and even. He helped her rinse the soap out of her hair, then handed her the shampoo. "Now, you help me." He gently caressed her cheek, bringing her eyes to his. "Trust me?" She nodded and began to do as he did to her, but stopped when he growled softly under his breath. She stopped and backed away with a whimpered apology. "I didn't mean. I'm sorry I hurt you." He shook his head, tilting his head back to look at her upside down. "It wasn't that kind of growl, Ayala." She frowned. There is the angry growl, the scared growl, the hurt growl. He whispered tenderly. That feels good, don't stop, growl. He rinsed the soap out of his own hair and moved to Ayala slowly, his blue eyes focused on her intently. She was hypnotized by his movement, and when he sat beside her and nuzzled at her neck and jaw, she gave him what she wanted without even thinking about it. He began to kiss her throat, sending shivers up and down her spine as he worked his way slowly across her jaw to her lips, gently teasing her, his hands sliding up and down her arms until he held her hands gently, lifting them so her hands were clasped behind her neck and they got much closer. She felt a tingle run through her body, and as she began to participate more eagerly, he growled again. He moved back to her neck, growling softly the entire time, and she felt her hands travel through his wet hair and pull on the strands. His back arched, and on her neck, he stopped moving suddenly and sucked hard. He pulled away, eyes flashing with something like pride. She gently touched the spot on her neck and her face flushed. It was tender and it felt hot to her touch. A hickey. He'd given her a hickey in the bathtub. He moved toward her again and whispered, "Don't look away. Look at me." He began to caress her, his eyes watching her face. He moved slowly, so not to startle her, and kissed her again, gently parting her lips and exploring her with his teeth, his lips, his tongue. When she returned his attentions, her hands wrapping around his neck of their own accord, her body straining to meet his. He placed a hand on her belly, between her hips. She froze at the pressure, and noticed what her body was doing. She blushed and meant to cast her face away, lowering her eyes, but he whispered, "No." She trembled and looked at him as he began to pet her, gently at first, making her arch into his hand, then a little more roughly, silencing her cries with his words, his lips. She began to tremble as he spoke to her softly, his voice husky with hunger. "Ayala, look at me. Don't look away. Look at me." Her back arched, her jaw locked, her fists balled tightly by her sides, and she screamed. When she looked away, she began to mutter, I'm sorry. I should have asked for permission. I'm sorry." Naruto gently touched her face, and she looked back. He had such tenderness in his eyes. Such passion, focused on her, and her alone. "You're beautiful. So beautiful. You'll never need to ask permission. Never again." He hugged her, and his eyes began to burn with hunger. "You know I would never hurt you." She nodded. They towel-dried each other, and he picked her up bridal style and carried her to bed, watching her the whole time. Both partners were ready and accepting, and as he lowered her to the mattress, she did not shiver with fear. She knew what he wanted from her, but this time, she was a willing partner, not to be pinned down or tied up. Instead of mounting her like she expected, he propped up several pillows and leaned back against them, pulling her onto him, giving her control. She kissed him thankfully, and accepted him with a startled gasp as he pulled her down on him, exerting the little bit of control he could as his eyes glassed over with pleasure. She allowed him to enjoy the heat and pressure before rocking backward. He groaned and kept trying to sit up to hold her, but she pushed him down every time. He seemed to not get the message and kept trying to sit up, the pair of them as close as they could get as humans. They came close to the edge together, and when she melted into a puddle of goo, he managed to sit up and he rolled them so he had the leverage, and began to thrust for his turn to melt. She encouraged him from the edges of her daze, and when he collapsed on her, thrusting madly, she held him tight. It was a hot, sticky, and wonderful union. When she pushed him off, he rolled to one side, but opened his arm for her, eyes clouded. She curled up next to him and drifted off immediately, his fingers caressing the darkened skin in the small of her back. Naruto was the first to awake in the morning, and he knew something was off when he couldn't sit up. His eyes popped open and he noticed that his entirely chest was covered in really dark brown hair. A few stray strands would rise up every time Ayala breathed. He smiled and started to trace patterns on her bare back. So it actually happened last night? Naruto asked himself in a whisper. He did admit that part of him believed that it was dream. And another part of him was sad that it happened. And this was because their actions in the night sealed his fate. He was absolutely sure that he was now totally in love with the woman on his chest. And he knew that she wouldn't be able to stay. Athena said that was against the rules. Plus she was immortal. She would outlive him anyway. He sighed sadly but then smiled. Meh, he would take what he could get. Why couldn't he enjoy the time they had now? Fuck, Zeus. So he slowly shook her awake with a smile. Come on, beautiful. Wake up. He watched her slowly lift her head from his chest where he could clearly see a little puddle of drool. Which was gross but cute in a weird way. She reached up and moved the hair out of her face before she locked eyes with him. He smirked, "Did you sleep well?" She didn't answer but instead looked around their sleeping space. The sheets and comforters were ruffled badly and neither one of them were wearing clothes. No clothes? Oh, dear gods. They had, didn't they? Oh, gods. Naruto found her facial expressions amusing. It went from, "I just woke up," to, "Dear Cammy, where are my clothes?" Then to, "I better not have," and finally to, "Oh Cammy, I did. Didn't I?" Ayala made a familiar, eep sound and her face turned as red as a fire hydrant before she jumped off the bed and made a beeline for the bathroom, giving Naruto a very nice view in the process. Naruto laughed at how much seemed like Hinata just then. He smiled and put on some sweats before going to the bathroom and walking in. Ayala wouldn't meet his eyes and she appeared to be embarrassed. He sat down next to her and took her hand. "Ayala, talk to me." "What's wrong?" She still wouldn't meet his eyes but she seemed insecure. "Was I bad?" "I was bad, wasn't I? I didn't do anything right. I didn't ask permission or—" Naruto leaned around and cut her off with a kiss. "Shush. You were great. More than great. You are beautiful and there aren't any rules to love." Ayala's eyes widened. Did he just say that? She had been wanting to hear that for so long but was too scared to accept it. She smiled slightly to herself. Naruto smirked, proud that he had gotten through to her. He grinned, "So how was I? I'm surprised that you can still walk." Ayala looked at him and mirrored his smirk. "You were okay. For a mortal anyway. But don't get cocky. I'm not weak in the knees or anything." Naruto frowned before he grinned deviously. He stood up and swept her into his arms and walked back to the bedroom. "Oh, so you're pulling the mortal card, huh? You're going to be eating those words in a few hours." Ayala looked nervous at first before she laughed mockingly. "A few hours? I bet you could barely last a few minutes." Naruto raised an eyebrow. "Do you forget what's sealed inside of me? I'm like a battery that can recharge itself." Ayala's eyes widened. "Now wait, Naruto." She didn't get to finish. Naruto had already sealed her mouth with his own. There had been many weekends like that one. She had many experiences like that one he had promised her, hours and hours. But her training came in handy because she hadn't just been trained, she had been taught. And now, she was the teacher, introducing fellatio, little things that vibrated, and her wide collection of lingerie that he enjoyed every time. But in May, something incredible happened. They had been cuddling together on an early Sunday morning after a long, hot and heavy run, when he sat up, looking frantic. He shook her shoulder. "Ayala, quickly. We're going to need baby stuff. Diapers. Food." She asked angrily, "You didn't think of this ahead of time? I thought I had 9 months. She rolled her eyes. "With Athena it's almost instantaneous. You're going to be getting a kid nearly 5 months old." He whimpered and threw on his clothes, stopping to kiss her on his way by. When he returned about an hour later, Ayala was in their room, putting together an IKEA crib with a good mattress. She frowned, and then smiled as she screwed the last part into place. She began to put it together in a soft green color decorated with ladybugs. She despised pink. He shouldered his way through the door, eyes wet. "She's sick." He set a small bundle, not nearly the size of a 4 or 5-month-old baby, in the center of the bed and ran for the bookshelf, eyes frantic. He began to flip through the book, looking for something useful while Ayala picked up the tiny child and unwrapped her. Her belly was swollen and her mouth was dry. She looked at Ayala with gray eyes and started to cry, her head covered with fine, downy blonde hair. Naruto still flipped through his book. Ayala growled at him, "She isn't sick. She's starving. Go heat up some formula for her. It's in the cupboard over the microwave, but don't you dare microwave it." He hurried to do as she asked, heating the formula in a pot of water over the stove. Ayala called, "Put it in a bowl. One don't know if she's strong enough to suck it out of a bottle." He made a small sound and did as she asked. He put the bowl next to Ayala, who, taking a few drops of lukewarm formula on her finger, smeared the liquid on the girl's lips with a tender hand. A teeny pink tongue flicked out and licked it away. Ayala repeated this several times before taking a facecloth from the bathroom and soaking it in the formula, putting the corner into the little girl's mouth. She sucked feebly, and Ayala rewarded her by squeezing a little of the formula into her mouth. Ayala looked at Naruto, who was hovering at her elbow. "Understand?" He nodded and took over, as Ayala continued to set up the corner nursery, finishing it with a small mobile that played Clair de la Lune, furnished with 7 small silver owls that chased each other around a harvest moon. By then, Naruto had her cradled on his shoulder, burping her gently. The bowl was empty and he asked softly, "How did you know?" Ayala looked at the small bundle and shook her head. I don't." When she was burped and laid down for a nap, Ayala watched from the door, ashamed of herself. What had that helpless little child done to deserve a curse like the one she had put on her? She sighed and turned away when Naruto touched her hand. He gestured for her to look at the sleeping bundle. He whispered, putting an arm around her waist. "Her name is Annabeth." His eyes were tender. "She's mine, no." He broke off, then tilted Ayala's chin up to look at him. "She's ours now." Now, it was nearly July, and Annabeth had grown considerably. She learned quickly, and Ayala had been telling her stories every night in a different language. When Naruto asked why, Ayala responded with a mysterious, "It keeps her brain active." Naruto was sitting on the floor one day, typing out his latest plot bunny while keeping an eye on Annabeth. To his surprise, she sat up, and tossed her rattle out of reach. She whimpered and pointed at it, wanting it back. When he continued typing, intent on finishing his sentence, she wailed, "Pa!" He looked up with a startled jump as Ayala laughed at his meek retrieval of the rattle. That night, when Ayala put Annabeth down, Naruto was in the shower. Ayala looked at Annabeth, and turned on the owls, and began to whisper to her in English, "There once was a small boy named Andrew. Now he was a very poor boy, and lived all by himself in a cabin in the woods, with only his mice friends for company. The mice people were very kind to Andrew, and wanted the best for him. So, when they got word from a wizard who could talk to the mice people, that an evil king was running the land with an iron fist, they were very scared. They told Andrew right away, not wanting him to get hurt. The evil king's armies were not very far away, the wizard had said, and they were preparing to attack the forests." She heard the water shut off, but continued. "That night, a great fire ravaged the forests, burning the homes of all who lived there, even Andrew's. When the mice people perked out of their holes in the morning, all they found was silver ashes scattered everywhere, and Andrew laying on his bed, which had been crushed by the ceiling, moaning and groaning. His back was broken, and there was nothing the mice people could do to fix it. The sink began to run, cutting Ayala off. Annabeth whimpered, her gray eyes pleading in her small face. The wizard appeared then, and told Andrew to get up. He was scared, telling Andrew that he was the only one who could defeat the evil king. Andrew groaned at the wizard, telling him that he couldn't move. His back hurt him so much, and how could any poor boy who lived in the woods have any hope of defeating an evil king? The wizard presented Andrew with a magic suit of fine clothes and an enchanted sword that glittered bright blue. If wizard said that if Andrew used them, he would become a good prince that would defeat the evil king. The mice people took the clothes from the wizard and helped Andrew into them, and the magic woven into the fine silk healed his spine, forever. The good Prince Andrew took his sword from the wizard, and promised to avenge the forest he had lived in for so long, as well as everything that had lived in it with him and his friends, the mice people. Annabeth was out cold now, sleeping happily beneath her owls, but Ayala's tale was not done. She heard the bathroom door creak, but made nothing of it. The good prince marched the head of the evil king's army, full of goblins and ghouls and spiders. The king looked like Hephaestus' nightmare, wrought of iron that glowed on the edges and smoking orange eyes that burned straight to his soul. But the good prince was not afraid of the evil king. He took up his magic sword and fought the king to the death. Just as all hope was lost and the good prince about to meet his end, the mice people rode in, knocked over the evil king, stealing his weapon from his grasp, and leaving him defenseless. Once again, the good prince took up his enchanted sword and put the tip into the evil king's chin, and said. Naruto took her hand and smiled. And said? Something very forgettable. She smiled cheekily. He kissed her and led her out into the living room where they sat on the couch. Before he could turn on the television, Ayala whispered, "Naruto." He looked at her and frowned. "What's wrong?" She inhaled sharply. "If I told you that I can control to conceive right here, right now, what would you do? Would you want?" She looked away, flushing with embarrassment. "Would you want me to carry our child?" He inhaled slowly, and she prepared herself for the worst. When he answered, it was a nod, a soft, spoken word, and a kiss to seal the deal as he helped her out of her clothes, and she helped him out of his. The next 4 months were hectic for Naruto. He had expected that Ayala's pregnancy would be hectic and abnormal, but he wasn't ready for the hormones or how quickly things escalated. She grew a baby bump very quickly and she would get cravings. Those were the most consistent symptoms. The growing and the eating. But then she would randomly get morning sickness and be sick in bed the entire day, and the next she would be healthy enough to go on a warpath. Naruto mainly just kept his mouth shut and played with Annabeth, who had continued to grow and learn. She could crawl and climb things, but she had yet to master the art of walking independently. He was quickly surprised at how much she was starting to look like him. It was almost scary. He secretly wondered if Athena had done that on purpose. But one of the most amusing things that Naruto found was Ayala's irrational love for ramen. He had introduced it to her one day when he wanted something different for dinner. He had learned how to make it from his favorite ramen stand after the war. But Ayala had taken to it like a fish to water, even though Naruto constantly reminded her that it wasn't very nutritious or healthy. His only saving grace was that Annabeth was a good baby. She normally slept all night and rarely cried. So he was able to get the sleep he needed to deal with the pregnant goddess. It was mid-November and Naruto was rocking Annabeth in his arms, trying to get her to sleep. He had already fed, burped, and changed her. He sighed and spoke softly to her, "You're a beautiful, do you know that?" She yawned cutely and closed her eyes. Naruto smiled and nuzzled his cheek against hers. He loved her so much that it hurt sometimes. He wondered if that was just part of being a parent. Finally, she slipped into sleep and he set her down in the crib. He had renovated his storage room and turned it into a baby room. Half the room was decorated with silver owls and blue walls. Ayala was working on the other side of the room. She had hung a tarp that separated Annabeth's side from the other. He wasn't allowed behind the tarp, something he constantly complained about. Then he heard a shout that made him jump out of his skin. "Naruto, my water just broke." His eyes widened and he looked towards the shout frantically. "What? Right now? The hell? Don't ask questions. Just get in here, you blonde asshole." He sighed. He was gonna need coffee. Lots of it. Labor was long and hard. Naruto, if not hovering anxiously, was hiding with Annabeth in the baby room. When her cervix began to dilate, stretching to accommodate the child's head, he started to freak out on the inside, even though his exterior was strangely calm. Holding her hand, he sat beside her with his other hand on her rounded belly and his eyes on the clock. The contractions were getting stronger and were only about 10 minutes apart. It had been almost 10 hours since her water broke, and he was getting nervous about her energy levels. She could only draw on so much in her mortal form. She grabbed his wrist and muttered something incoherent. He ran his fingers through her dark hair. She growled at him again. Then, "Parking lot, help." He bolted from the room with the speed of lightning and was gone. She rolled onto her stomach, squeezing her eyes shut against another contraction, gritting her teeth. Mortal births, she was told, were usually pretty easy. Immortal births didn't require carrying or delivery, only a wish between two partners to conceive. Tada, baby. But these cross-species babies were hard to carry and often lost in the birthing process. Not to mention this was her first time carrying. Only time carrying. She vowed to herself. Her mind fought against her body as she felt an overwhelming desire to push. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, then was caught by surprise when there was a loud thump and Annabeth crawled into the room, her gray eyes wide. She grabbed the edge of the bed and used it to pull herself up, hands reaching for Ayala. She didn't say anything, but teetered dangerously before failing backward onto her well-cushioned diaper bum. Ayala scooped the child up, hugging her tight, burying her face in her sweet-smelling hair for comfort. She tensed and whimpered as a second contraction rolled through her, wishing Naruto would hurry the heck up. Annabeth asked, "Where Pa?" "Downstairs, honeybee." "Why?" She made a kissing sound and pointed at her elbow, where she had bumped into the leg of the table playing tag with Naruto. He had made it better with a kiss and a tickle. Ayala had watched him. "Pa do. Pa do." She put a little warm hand on her surrogate mother's belly. Her little mouth fumbled on the next word, trying several times to make the right sound before giving up and saying, "Edo." "Here." Annabeth hugged Ayala tenderly, then burst through the door and Annabeth frowned. Ayala began to cry with relief and enfolded him close to her, whimpering, "Make it stop. Make it stop." He gently kissed her cheek, trying to comfort her when Ayala felt him being pushed away. Annabeth said, "No, no Pa." She made her kissing sound and shook her head. "No." She pointed at Than. "No Pa." Naruto stood laughing quietly in the doorway. He held several things in his hands, prepared at last. Ayala growled at him. "Quit laughing at me, you fucktard. You try carrying someone else's spawn for nearly 6 months. His eyes flared red with anger, but then quickly turned sober and humble. He left his supplies at the foot of the bed and pushed them out of the way to kiss her. Annabeth giggled and covered her eyes, and then feigned interest in Naruto's books. He gently moved her down the edge of the bed, placing a pad not unsimilar to the ones on Annabeth's changing table under her bum and moved to wipe the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. "Trust me?" She nodded wearily. "We're gonna deliver a baby. You and me. Together." She was leaning back on then, his shoulders and chest a rather hard and bony, but useful, stack of pillows. Naruto was gently examining her, poking and prodding in ways that made her shiver happily. He smiled up at her cheekily and winked. He took her hand and whispered softly, "You're going to push on the next contraction. Long and hard. We'll count to 10. She nodded, not really caring anymore. She just wanted it to be over. She pushed and excruciating pain rocketed up her spine. She screamed, crushing Naruto's hand in her own and squeezing Than's thigh with all her remaining strength. She ended that contraction panting. She whimpered, "How many more?" He was silent, eyes wide with fear. Naruto. Answer me," he whispered softly. "She's come feet first." Annabeth poked her head out from behind Than's wings, her hands full of feathers. Then whispered, "It's going to hurt a hell of a lot more, Ayala." She slumped, eyes full of tears. Annabeth disappeared again, playing in her tiny room filled with soft feathers. The next half hour was filled with her screaming, then making her move her hand as she got terrifyingly close to his no-no zone, and Naruto supporting a tiny body with no head to be seen. His hands were bloody, her vision was blurring, and she was on the verge of unconsciousness. She felt the contraction come again and pushed as hard as she could, convinced she was going to die. There was a great release of pressure and everyone fell silent. Then, rising and falling in the early morning, was the cry of a newborn. Ayala started to cry with relief as the child was folded into her arms, and immediately began to suckle. Then moved away, letting Naruto take his spot so Ayala and the baby could lean against him, as he watched with huge, protective eyes. Then tied off the umbilical cord and let Naruto cut it. He then walked out the door and closed it behind him. Ayala's eyes focused on the little girl when she stopped feeding and almost immediately after being burped, fell asleep. They couldn't be sure of eye color for a few weeks, but Ayala wanted her to have her father's blue eyes. Her hair was a light pinkish color, but would darken to a beautiful red when she got older. Naruto whispered, his voice tentative, almost afraid. "Can I hold her?" Ayala hesitated before tucking the girl into Naruto's arms, with a soft reminder to mind her head. He nodded. "I know." Then he turned and looked at the little girl tucked preciously into the crook of his elbow. Naruto looked down with wonder at his new daughter. "Oh wow. Look at you." He felt his eyes begin to water and he smiled. Normally he would try to hold back tears, but these were the good kind, so he figured it was okay. Then he suddenly felt very calm and he felt a weight press in on his side. He looked to his right and saw the smiling face of his mother looking back up at him before she looked at the baby in his arms. "She's beautiful, Naruto," Kushina said before she stretched up to kiss his cheek. "Good luck. I love you." And with that the image of his mother faded away and he was left feeling confused but happy. He looked at Ayala to see if she saw it, but she was asleep. She and the bed were clean and she was tucked neatly under the covers. "Ah, then must have done that," Naruto said quietly to himself before looking back at his daughter. Naruto smiled down at her. "You need a name." How about Lucy?" "Yeah, I like Lucy. We'll see what your mother says though." And then he noticed something off about the baby that he didn't notice before. She had whisker marks. They weren't as dark as his, but they were definitely visible. Naruto looked on in confusion. "I thought that those were birthmarks caused by Kurama's chakra." And they were. The fox confirmed that himself. Naruto's eyes narrowed. That meant Lucy had a chakra system. And Kurama's chakra must have been so fused with him that some of it was passed on to her. He hadn't prepared for this outcome. He assumed that Ayala's godliness would overpower his own DNA. Apparently not. and he didn't know what effect it would have on his child. Damn, he wished Tsunade was here. He sighed and went to get Annabeth. He found her in her side of the baby room blinking furiously trying to stay awake. He grinned before walking over to her and picking her up. She didn't fight and instead fell asleep on his shoulder almost immediately. He set her down in the crib and tucked her in. He headed back out to the living room and laid down on the couch with Lucy in his arms. He was sure that she'd be up and hungry in few hours, so decided to get all the sleep he could. He sighed and slipped into blissful unconsciousness.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.